Before gods had temples, before men had names, before myths were carved into the stone spines of the mountains, there was winter. It did not arrive with warning or rhythm, no season to prepare for, no pattern to honor. It came when it wished, and it left when it had taken enough. The earliest dwellers in the lands that would someday be called Hellas had no calendars, no timekeepers, no written words to define what gripped them each cycle. But they knew it when it came. They called it nothing, for they had no word that could speak against it. They simply buried themselves deeper into caves, pressed their backs to rock that breathed frost, and waited. The cold was not air, it was presence, a thing that moved with the patience of age and the cruelty of something that did not know kindness. And each year it returned, darker, longer, harsher. The trees shed their leaves, as if in fear. The animals vanished not into hibernation, but into the earth itself. The wind howled not in gusts, but in low groaning syllables that scraped against bone. It sounded like a name no one could translate, and so the old ones called it the nameless cold. They would sit around their fires, the few they could coax to life, and speak of years when the cold took entire clans. They remembered eyes freezing open, children buried beneath white silence, entire valleys where the air was so still, it shattered when breathed too deeply. They whispered that the cold was not just a force, but a being, not a god, but older than gods, something that came before all things and would outlast them. It was said the cold had once walked the world freely until fire was stolen from it by the stars. Since then it waited, returning each year to try and reclaim what it had lost. The tribes began to offer songs, then firewood, then animals to the cold. But the cold did not bargain. It did not listen. Then they offered humans, not in hatred, in hope. Children born under snow were taken to the mountains and left with their names tied around their necks in knots of braided hair. If the winds spared the valley that year, they believed the offering had been accepted. If not, they sent 2 the next time, then 3, then more. The practice became rite. The rite became belief. The belief became religion. And the religion was fear. When the first city-states rose, the custom was already older than their walls. Priests wore cloaks of icicle thread and white paint. They carried the memory of the frost in bowls made of cracked jawbone and sang into hollows carved from glacial stone. The names of the cold changed. In some regions it was Krios, in others, Animos. Finally, it became Boreas, the name that stuck. But to the wind, names were meaningless. The wind had never stopped. The wind did not need worship, but it enjoyed rhythm, and so the rhythm of the offerings was tolerated. The gods of Olympus, new to the world, did not speak of Boreas. They built their thrones on peaks high above the worst of the chill. But even Zeus could not stop the snow. Even Apollo's warmth bent in the path of the frost. Hera shrouded herself in cloaks spun from storm clouds. And Athena, goddess of wisdom, left winter off her scrolls. Only Hestia, keeper of the hearth, remained where mortals did, and even she grew quiet during the deepest freezes. It was said that the cold respected Hestia, not because of her fire, but because of her stillness. She did not try to fight the wind. She endured it. That was what mortals never understood. They built fires, built walls, built temples and stories, and still they died. Because the cold was not an enemy. It was a cycle, a return, and you cannot defeat something that is only doing what it was always meant to do. In the highlands of Thessaly, there were villages that believed Boreas walked among them, not in the shape of wind, but in the form of a man. Tall, pale, eyes like frozen lakes. He would appear during the first snow, say nothing, take a single loaf of bread, and vanish. If he smiled, the winter would be kind. If he frowned, they would lose their cattle. If he wept, they would lose their children. They told this to outsiders, who laughed. But when those outsiders stayed the winter, they were found in spring with frost in their lungs, and their laughter turned to ice. In the islands, where the cold came slower, it was more subtle. There, Boreas was said to sail in a boat made of whalebone and clouds, carrying a net of silence. He would drift past the coasts, and if a child heard him hum, they would not wake the next day. So mothers sang louder, filling the night with lullabies, hoping their voices would keep the wind from noticing their children. In the mountains, they carved stories into stone, not to honor the gods, but to keep their memories alive, in case they froze. These stories tell of a woman who walked barefoot into the snow to find her lost brother, and returned as a statue of salt, of a shepherd who built a tunnel through the mountains so that sheep could pass, and vanished inside, of a girl who could hear the frost approaching in her dreams, and drew maps with her blood to guide others through the safe paths. None of them were heroes, only survivors, and even they eventually fell silent. Winter in ancient Greece was not poetic. It was survival. It was the hush of empty villages, the creak of wood splitting in the night, the sound of wind breathing against stone like a giant asleep. It was hands blackened from cold before the sun rose. It was children learning not to cry because tears froze too fast. It was silence becoming prayer, and prayer becoming memory, and memory becoming myth. And in every myth was the wind, Boreas, or what he had always been, the first reminder that the world did not belong to us. They say that once the gods began to walk among mortals, the balance of fear shifted. Storms were given faces, rivers names, trees personalities, and fire a keeper. But the cold remained what it always was, unnamed in its deepest form. And yet, there were men who believed that anything could be challenged. Anything could be slain, provided one had the courage, the weapons, and the songs to remember it by. These were not kings, nor were they prophets. They were something in between the ones who came before myths hardened into marble, before tragedies were written into scrolls. In the southern reaches of what would become Arcadia, when the first frost descended earlier than expected, swallowing flocks and turning harvest to ash overnight, a man named Linos swore vengeance on the sky itself. He crafted a spear tipped with obsidian and covered himself in oil mixed with crushed thyme and goat's blood, believing the scent would mask his warmth. They said he climbed the highest ridge and waited for Boreas himself to descend in the mist. He was never seen again, but that winter was milder. And so the legend grew, that perhaps the cold could be appeased, not with sacrifice, but with defiance. In other regions, there were tales of hammers forged from the cores of meteors, swung by blacksmiths whose arms were burned in volcanic fires. They forged shields etched with the sun's eye, meant to blind the wind. They trained animals, wolves and lions, to walk beside them in the snow, as if to show nature itself that man would not cower. One hero, Epimenon of Pylos, was said to have captured a northern wind in a bronze vessel and poured it into the sea, turning waves to mist. Whether any of it happened is irrelevant. What matters is that belief took root. For centuries, the approach of winter was met not only with dread, but preparation. Young men gathered in stone circles to chant words older than their ancestors. Children were taught to walk barefoot in frost to harden their blood. Temples turned into arsenals. Priests began carrying knives alongside incense. The line between faith and warfare thinned until it disappeared. In the highlands, villages built walls of animal bone and feather, believing wind respected those who used its symbols. Women braided hair into nets, meant to catch the voice of Boreas. Fires were made not in hearths, but on altars, facing north, their smoke rising like threats. Yet the cold remained unimpressed. In the year of the triple eclipse, the rivers froze solid within hours, splitting stone bridges in half. Wolves descended into cities. Frostbitten warriors dropped swords that shattered upon impact. Children dreamed of ice so deep it spoke in vowels. And when they awoke, their eyes were white. Still, the heroes came. Cledion, who carved a tunnel through the Pelion to reach what he claimed was the heart of the winter. Aetheta, who climbed Mount Timphristos naked save for a harp, singing to the snow to let her pass. Thalion, who walked into a frozen lake with a torch and whispered, "I am not afraid," just before the ice swallowed him whole. These names are not in official records. They were kept in cave walls, in soot, in the memory of grandmothers and the rhythms of lullabies. But they were real as the silence that follows when a fire dies. What these men and women learned, and what they never told the world, was that the cold does not answer to courage. It respects rhythm, not rebellion. One village built a tower of salt, believing that cold fears purity, but the wind licked it into dust. Another carved a massive horn to blow songs of warning. The horn froze from the inside out, and when it was finally lifted, it cracked open and released not sound, but frost that killed every living thing in a 50-step radius. The gods watched, or maybe they didn't. Perhaps they too had grown wary of this force that paid them no reverence. It was said even Ares, god of war, refused to march during deep winter. That Dionysus turned to wine not for pleasure, but to forget how many vines died beneath frost. That Hades, lord of the dead, barred the gates of his realm during solstice, fearing what might enter from above. And so the mortals stood alone. And in that isolation, they created legends. Not for glory, for memory, for the comfort that even if they lost, they had once tried. One scroll, found buried beneath the remains of a collapsed sanctuary near Delphi, tells of a boy who sang to the wind each night for 7 winters. His voice was so steady that the snow never fell around his home. But on the 8th winter, he fell silent. The snow returned. The land froze so fast it cracked trees from the inside. The scroll ends with a single line. Perhaps the wind liked his song, and in that line lies all the truth ancient Greece dared whisper. That winter was never about temperature. It was about presence, an entity that came to listen, to remind, to ask something unspoken, perhaps a price owed, perhaps a pact broken, or maybe simply because it could. The final generation of heroes were not warriors. They were dreamers. They sat in stone circles during the coldest nights, eyes closed, hands linked, breathing together until the air around them hummed. They claimed they could feel the frost's pulse, that it slowed near them, that it waited. But their names too faded. The cold does not keep monuments. It erases, and still the snow falls, and still the stories linger. Not because they won, but because they were told. After the weapons were dulled, after the songs grew hoarse, after the gods turned their faces and the fires shrank into sparks, the people of ancient Greece began to do what they had always feared. Listen, there was something in the stillness between the gusts, something older than the first names carved into wood. It was not a message, nor a warning, nor a voice that begged to be heard. It was simply being. The cold did not scream. It did not rage. It arrived like breath, like the absence of sound, like memory. And when the heroes were gone, swallowed by frost or forgotten by those who feared remembering the villages grew quiet, in that quiet, a new form of reverence was born. Not worship, not resistance, but attunement. The elders sat outside during the coldest hours of night, still as stone, letting their breath disappear into the air like ghosts. They studied the patterns of wind against the cliffside. They counted the seconds between the cracking of ice on their walls. They noticed how animals turned their backs to the mountain before the worst of the snow arrived. They learned that silence was not empty. It was a shape, and that shape had rules. Whole communities reorganized around that understanding. They no longer built temples to Boreas. They built their homes into the hillsides, facing away from the peaks. They learned to bury warmth, storing hot coals in clay sealed beneath the floor. Children were taught not to cry in winter, not because tears might freeze, but because the wind might listen. And if the wind heard sorrow, it might remember what sorrow felt like. And if it remembered, it might not leave. These teachings were never written. They were not chanted. They were held in gesture, the way a hand brushed snow from a threshold, the way a mother opened her door a few moments before stepping through, allowing the wind time to notice and pass. This quiet knowledge, passed from breath to breath, became more sacred than any oracle's words. Some claimed that the cold respected it, that winters, while never merciful, grew less violent, that snow fell softer, that rivers froze more slowly. But no one dared to say it aloud, because even a whisper was a ripple. And a ripple in the frost could wake something ancient. In a northern coastal village, now long lost to maps, there was once a woman named Thessa who spoke to frost like a friend. She said the cold had dreams that it remembered times when no fire danced, no voice echoed, no foot disturbed the whiteness of stone, that the cold was lonely. She would sit at the edge of the frozen bay and hum, not songs, but syllables, vowels, without language. Her village, it is said, survived 30 winters without a death, until one night she fell silent. The next morning the ice cracked in patterns that resembled tears. Her body was never found, but a frost mark in the shape of her seated form remained on the shoreline for generations. Others tried to speak to the cold after her, but none were heard, because she had not spoken for herself. She had spoken for the wind, and now it had nothing to say. Further south, in the limestone cliffs beyond Corinth, another practice emerged. People began carving small alcoves into the rock and filling them with warm stones and dried herbs. Not shrines, not offerings, just warmth left unguarded. Some believed it was a gift to the cold, a reminder of what it could have if it ceased to take. Others believed it was a trick to lure the wind into stillness. But the real reason was simpler. The people were tired. Tired of praying. Tired of fighting. Tired of names. So they gave what they could, in silence, without story. And the cold took it, or didn't. And still they survived. One year, the frost did not come at all. Spring arrived early, and the valleys burst into bloom like never before. The rivers sang, children danced barefoot in fields. But the elders were uneasy. They said nothing. They watched the clouds, listened to the birds, waited. That autumn, the wind returned with a voice, not a scream, not a howl, a chorus. The air itself sang, high and slow and endless. The ground frosted overnight. Trees split open. Salt water froze. Time seemed to stutter. And in that season, the people understood. It had not been mercy that spared them. It had been waiting. And now, it remembered. After that winter, the carvings changed. People no longer wrote about heroes or gods. They etched spirals into stone. They traced circles in the dirt. They mapped silence. And in those shapes, they placed no names. Only breath, only absence. Because the Greeks of the last frost knew. The cold does not speak. It echoes. It repeats what it was given. It holds memory like ice holds light. If you give it fear, it brings terror. If you give it sound, it brings scream. But if you give it silence, it brings sleep. Not death, not peace. Just sleep. And sleep was enough. In the last known account before written winter, rituals ceased altogether. A boy named Erastes drew a map in snow. He said it showed where the cold was born. He walked alone into the hills, barefoot, humming. He never returned. But the snow where he passed never melted. It glowed faintly in moonlight. No one followed. No one erased the map. And year by year, the snow along that trail remained undisturbed, as if something still walked there. as if something still remembered, and in remembering, still waited. By the time myths began to harden into philosophy, and oracles were challenged by scrolls, the cold had long ago made its presence into a rhythm that no longer surprised but still disturbed. The ancient Greeks, once content to blame the frost on gods and forgetfulness, began to seek answers in patterns, in the stars, in ratios and resonances. There was a shift in the air, not in the weather itself, which remained as brutal and as unyielding as always, but in the way people began to understand its cycles. The earliest thinkers of Ionia stared up at the constellations and noticed that certain winters were longer when specific stars aligned. Others recorded the way birds migrated or didn't, how goats grew thicker coats some years before the snow, how the sound of waves in summer sometimes carried the cold months ahead like a message no ear knew how to interpret. In Samos, a student of Pythagoras named Heron claimed that the wind came in 13s, not days, not nights, but pulses of presence. He measured gusts with weights on strings, counting not the strength, but the rhythm. The wind, he wrote, has a breath, and between that breath is intention. No one understood him. He was dismissed as a mystic lost in numbers. But when he died, his bones were found frozen in the shape of a spiral, his fingers locked in position as if still counting. His scrolls were copied but never again read aloud. In Thebes, a woman named Clydike kept records of frosts spread across olive trees. She measured how deeply the cold reached into bark, how long it took for sap to stop flowing, how birds changed their song before the snow. She believed the cold was drawn to rhythm, to repetition, and if one could match its pulse, one could perhaps escape it. Her students placed drums around the village, played in specific intervals through the night. That winter, no deaths were recorded. The next year, the drums fell out of sync. 12 people froze within a week. No one played again. In Delphi, long before the oracle's voice was eclipsed by logic, a boy named Timon stood for 3 days in a temple doorway, eyes closed, listening. He claimed he could hear the thoughts of the frost. He spoke no words, only wrote what he called echoes. I do not come to kill, I come to remind. You have forgotten what the stillness was. Every flame screams. He died that spring when the sun rose too quickly. Some said the light cracked something in him. Others believed he had belonged to the cold, and warmth rejected him. In the Pythagorean schools, numbers were seen not just as measures, but as forms of purity. One teacher theorized that winter only descended when balance was broken, when the equation of the world tipped too far into sound or chaos. He created sequences meant to anchor warmth, series of tones, architectural ratios, water measurements, breath patterns. His students lived in near silence, building dwellings at golden ratios, eating in rhythm, sleeping in pairs. For 5 years, the snow never touched them. In the 6th year, they made a single error, a window built 1 inch too wide. That night, the cold came not through the walls, but through the lungs. They were found aligned, frozen in sleep, mouths open, eyes peaceful. Not a single track of snow, just air, too still. Farther west, near the coast, a philosopher named Drios believed the cold was not a natural force, but a memory of the world. He described it as the echo of the universe before light, a pressure trying to return to the moment before time. The frost, he wrote, is not here to end us. It is here to reset. He taught his followers to fast during winter, not for discipline, but to thin themselves, to become like shadows, to slip past the cold's attention. Those who succeeded lived into old age. Those who faltered vanished. And none who vanished were mourned, for it was believed the frost had noticed them. And once noticed, it never forgot. In Athens, a skeptic named Lamech mocked it all. He built a house entirely of bronze and fire, filled it with steam and mirrors. He proclaimed himself the Sun Man, a being immune to winter's lies. The first night of snowfall, the house glowed red. On the second, the mirrors cracked. On the third, the house was found empty, untouched, the fires still burning. Lamech's footprints led outside, then simply stopped, as if he had been lifted, as if the cold had reached down and removed him gently. Not in rage, but in curiosity. These were not superstitions. These were observations. Each story passed not as fear, but as data. And yet all data pointed to the same thing. The cold was not consistent. It was not random either. It moved in patterns too complex for minds born of warmth. Those who approached it with reverence found silence. Those who mocked it found absence. Those who ignored it found sleep. And so, the schools changed. Instead of challenging the frost, they tried to chart it. Instead of defeating it, they recorded its breath. Scrolls were inked not with warnings, but with questions. Could cold carry memory? Could silence be mapped? Could warmth be too loud? And what if winter was not a season, but a door? One man, a silent wanderer, known only as Milan, walked from Thrace to Sparta barefoot each winter for 17 years. He left no letters, no home, no voice, only footsteps, perfectly spaced, always ending at the same stone just outside the city. Some believed he was seeking something, others believed he was warning something not to come closer. On the 18th year, his path did not appear. That winter, Sparta recorded its coldest season in memory. Fires froze, words froze, memory froze. And when spring came, none remembered what had been lost. Just that something had. The philosophers turned inward. Perhaps, they said, the frost was not coming from the mountains or the clouds, but from the mind itself. That winter was the world remembering something it was not meant to forget. That each breath of cold was the echo of a truth too large to hold. And so they taught their students not to fight it, not to name it, not to measure it, but to feel it, and to leave nothing behind for it to follow. They said, walk soft, speak less, dream slowly, and do not light fire unless you are ready to watch it die. By the dawn of structured governance and the age of city-states, the ancient Greeks had long abandoned the idea of resisting winter through bravery or songs. The age of heroes had failed. The age of philosophers could not outthink frost. So arose the age of order. Laws, calendars, architecture, these became the new weapons against the cold. In Athens, during the early reforms, Solon himself drafted a civic law regarding winter protocol. It was not spiritual, it was logistical. Every home required by decree a fire pit centered on a north-facing wall. Every citizen had to contribute 1 jar of oil, 1 bundle of wool, and 1 recorded memory of a winter lost. These memories were sealed in clay and buried under city stones. The hope was simple. If memory anchored warmth, the frost would not return where it was remembered. The city followed these laws for 7 winters. On the 8th, someone broke a jar. A child, unaware, playing in the street. That night, the winds came low and sharp. 17 died. No one blamed the child. They blamed forgetfulness. And so, Athens installed keepers of the frost, a group of silent scribes whose job was to remember winters in silence. They walked the streets at dusk, pressing fingers to walls, listening. In Sparta, always different, the cold became a rite of strength. Boys were cast into the hills at first snow, naked, unarmed. Those who returned were honored. Those who did not were named in frost-carved stones. But what few knew, sometimes none returned. And yet, names still appeared. Spartans carved names for the lost, even when they weren't sure anyone had gone. They believed the cold demanded names. If not given, it would take without pattern. In Corinth, engineers developed buildings with dual walls, the space between filled with salt, ash, and hair. These were meant to confuse the cold, which, they believed, followed scent. The buildings stood for 20 winters. On the 21st, the spaces began to sing. Low hums, wordless and slow. The builders panicked. The walls were opened. Nothing was found inside. But the frost returned with voices that year. Not screams, not whispers, just a presence that echoed music never played. The city went silent for years after. In Delphi, the priests tried to structure the calendar itself to contain winter. They removed days. They renamed months. They invented a season between, an artificial time where nothing was declared, no births, no deaths, no laws passed, no marriages performed. It was a silence of state. For a time, it worked. The snow came later. The frost lingered shorter. But then, children born in the season between began to vanish. First 1, then 3, then 9. It was as if the cold remembered the gap and filled it. Argos attempted a more spiritual engineering. They constructed a temple of breath, a structure with no walls, only narrow vertical stones spaced precisely to allow only certain wind patterns. It was said that standing inside, one could hear the words of the air, that if a citizen stood long enough, they would feel the path of the frost and avoid it. Some stood for days. One stood for weeks. On the final night, the wind shifted. Then shattered. Not exploded. Shattered. The pieces were warm, but unmoving. No trace of bones, only dust. And his smile, etched into stone, stayed for generations. On Delos, an island of balance, the winter was said to hesitate. The people believed the cold disliked the sea, that salt water disrupted its rhythm. So they built houses half submerged, connected by tunnels, never touching the land. They claimed success. For 25 years, no winter deaths. But they grew arrogant. They threw parties during solstice. They mocked the wind. One winter, the tide receded, and the cold walked across the seabed. It came not in gusts, but as steam, then silence. The next spring, the island was abandoned. Not ruined, not burned, empty. Doors open, fires still lit. No bodies. Just silence and cups of tea, still warm. These are not legends. These are the records inscribed not in myths, but in architecture, in policy, in civic design. Cities trying to outplan a presence that never followed plans. In roads, mathematicians tried to bind the cold in symbols. They built a circle of pillars, each carved with the equations of planetary motion, aligned with lunar breath. The center was hollow, a place where no wind touched. They called it the eye. It was forbidden to speak inside the eye. Only stand. Listen. Breathe. One winter, a child cried inside the eye. The next day, the pillars cracked, the stones bent inward, and the eye was gone. In its place, a hollow where no birds flew. No moss grew. No memory lingered. Governments tried to track frost, as one tracks storms. They failed. Scientists built mechanisms to measure its density, its pressure, its voice. They failed. Philosophers tried to rename it from Boreas to Hekros to pale silence, but the cold remained nameless. The only thing that worked, and even that not always, was rhythm, not symmetry, not power, just quiet, repeated rhythm. And even then, it was not victory, only delay. And so the people learned again what the elders once knew. That winter could not be governed, only welcomed without invitation. That laws break, that calendars fade, that buildings crumble, and that the frost will always find a way inside. Not through cracks, through names, through songs forgotten, through memories dropped in the street, through warmth that believed itself safe. They called it the seasonless year. The last winter when spring never arrived. Before that, there were still efforts, still attempts, still rituals cloaked as science, science cloaked as story. Villages created warmth libraries, underground vaults, filled with objects that had touched summer, Sun, warmed stones, bark from olive trees in bloom, vials of sweat collected during solstice festivals. These objects were catalogued, stored, and visited, not to be touched, just seen. It was believed that the mere memory of warmth could ward off cold if enough people remembered it once. So, each month, entire towns gathered to look, in silence, just to look. No words, no songs, just presence. Then one winter, a warmth vault cracked. No one knows why. Some say a boy fell asleep inside. Others claim a breath was spoken. The town froze within minutes, but the vault, what remained of it, was warm. Too warm. Unnaturally so. The frost did not melt it. It avoided it. And for years after, nothing grew on that land. No weeds, no moss, no shadows. Only a steady warmth without center. People began speaking of heat prisons, places where the cold could not go, not because it was banished, but because it chose not to. Some said it was because those places remembered warmth too loudly, that the frost disliked noise. Others whispered that warmth, when caged, became something else. Not comfort, not life, but threat. In a valley inn, Owl lost to maps. The city of Petrolos attempted to store not warmth, but motion. Believing that the cold came only for stillness, they engineered constant movement. Houses rotated on tracks. Floors vibrated faintly. Citizens wore cloaks made of rustling reeds. They trained themselves never to sleep at once. They believed that if a city never fully paused, it could never be frozen. And for 10 years, they were right. Then, during one solstice, the machinery halted, just for a moment. Less than a breath. That was enough. When travelers returned, they found the city untouched but unmoving. Birds frozen mid-wing. Water suspended mid-drip. People mid-word. And all of them warm to the touch. As if the cold had not killed them, just stopped them. As if, in punishing stillness, it had given them what they feared most: eternal motionlessness. Other villages took a different path. They whispered of a ritual called the unspoken fire, a way of burning thought instead of wood. Participants would enter a dark room, think of their warmest memory, and then let it go completely. No trace, no record. It was believed that if enough minds released warmth at once, it would rise like smoke and hide the village from the frost. No one knew if it worked. No one remembered who first taught it. But it became tradition. Every year, on the coldest night, people would gather and forget together. And still, the cold came. In the city of Telamon, scholars wrote a final scroll, titled simply, "On the Futility of Naming Cold." In it, they described the failure of every attempt to define frostby physics by pattern, by myth. The cold is not a thing, the scroll ends. It is the memory of all things ceasing. After that, Telamon ceased to exist, not destroyed, not vanished, just no longer spoken of. Maps erased it, mouths forgot it, and the cold was never seen there again, because it no longer needed to be. The frost, by then, had become something else. It did not descend. It did not retreat. It spread not in weather but in awareness. The moment one asked, "When will the snow stop?" the snow began. The moment one felt safe, the wind returned. Safety became scent, a trigger. And the cold learned to hunt it. And then, one year, spring did not arrive. The snow melted late, then froze again. Crops pushed through the dirt, then turned black. Birds migrated, then came back too soon. Confused, silent. Rivers thawed only to freeze again. People waited, planted, hoped, and then stopped. That was the seasonless year. No battles, no myths, just silence, just white, just the realization that the rhythm had broken, that whatever pact had once kept winter moving forward had ended. In some towns, the people walked into the woods and never returned, not out of fear, but surrender. In others, they built great mirrors to reflect light inward, as if hoping to become their own sun. The mirrors cracked, the light fell, and those who looked into them too long spoke only in fragments afterward. There are scattered stories of one man who walked from city to city, carrying a jar of sun-warmed oil. He poured it at thresholds, one drop each, whispering, "Remember." But none could say what happened to him. Some claim he melted. Others claim he is still walking, though now the oil is gone, and he pours only breath. The last memory of that year is carved into a stone hidden in the caves near ancient Mantinea. It is not a warning, not a story, just a sentence. We remembered too much, and under it, a single groove, like a tear. The frost returned every year after, but differently. No longer seasonal, no longer predictable. It would arrive in spring, or midsummer, or before dawn, and it would not linger, just brush against doors, breath on glass, reminder in the spine. And people stopped naming winters, stopped marking them, because they no longer had beginnings, no ends, just presence. And so the final lesson was unspoken. That warmth is not safety. That memory is not shelter. That forgetting may be the only true fire. And that when the cold comes, do not call it winter. Do not call it anything. Just sleep and let the frost pass through you as silence passes through sound. When memory no longer kept the cold at bay. When rituals fell into silence. When names disappeared from stones, and even the frost forgot whom it had taken, there emerged a different kind of human. They did not speak of resistance. They did not light fires or count the days. They were called the thesmoi by some, the unmarked by others, but they had no names for themselves. They did not need them. Their lives were measured not by age, but by stillness. How long they could remain without breath. How slow their hearts could beat beneath the snow. How deeply their eyes could stare into whiteness without blinking. They lived in the mountains above the clouds, in caves so narrow, even the wind hesitated to enter. They wore no cloth, only layers of silence. They slept through storms, eyes open. They bathed eye and ice, not to feel, but to forget. No one taught them. They were not a sect, not a tradition. They were the result of coldness made complete. Children born in the seasonless year, raised without stories, without warmth, without the promise of spring. And in that absence, they grew not cruel, not broken but emptied, not hollow, for hollow implies something is missing. They were still, perfectly, unchangingly still. A traveler once found them, or thought he did. He climbed too far while searching for a monastery lost to maps. He found a stone path, lined with frost that did not melt beneath his touch. He found figures sitting beneath ledges, unmoving, eyes half closed, skin pale as bone, but breathing so faintly it seemed they were dreaming the world into being. He tried to speak. No one answered. He shouted. Echoes returned, but not his voice. Other words. Older. Slower. They tasted like ice in his ears. He fled. Returned to the lowlands frostbitten and blind. All he said, over and over, was, "They are not waiting. They are remembering what the cold forgot." After that, no one sought them again. Not out of fear, but reverence. In the plains below, others began to mimic them. Slowly at first, parents teaching children not to flinch when wind pushed against doors, shepherds training flocks to walk silently, breath held, even in deep snow. Cities slowed their bells. Markets opened only in dusk hours when the light was softest. People began to move not as individuals, but as collective shadows. Words became gestures. Gestures became breaths. Breaths became pauses, and in those pauses, they found something that was not safety, but something else. A kind of invitation, not to live, but to remain. The cold did not retreat, but it watched, and where it watched, it sometimes stepped aside. Not always, not predictably, but like a predator recognizing quiet, recognizing something not prey. In this new age, no temples were built, no scrolls written, but stone markers appeared smooth, uncarved, placed only where snow remained longest. A language of placement, not of sound, an alphabet of absence. It was said that if you walked from marker to marker and matched your steps to your breath, you would reach a place where the frost could not see you. Not warm, not safe, just unseen. A woman named Ilthis, whose village disappeared during the second seasonless spring, became known among the few still trading along the coastal routes. She never wore shoes. She carried no food. Her skin was blue with cold, yet never cracked. She spoke only once, to a dying man, whispering, "The wind is a mirror. Do not show it anything." He died smiling. Another tale tells of the frozen library, not books, but slabs of ice carved with grooves. If you pressed your ear against them, it was said, you could hear moments from winters long past. Not voices, not events, but feelings. The sharpness of a child's first breath in snow, the weight of a last step before falling through ice, the sound of frost arriving beneath skin. People traveled miles to listen, and after listening, they forgot who they were. Willingly, they returned home, changed slower, colder, more silent, and they were welcomed. Because now, silence was strength. There were no rulers in this world, no borders, only zones of coldness, and the people who lived within them, learning to echo rather than resist. The sun still rose, but its warmth was not trusted. It was watched, like a guest who might steal something when you turned away. Fire was used sparingly, hidden, contained in deep pits. Laughter was practiced only underground, muffled. Music was almost extinct, except for a single tone, played once a year at the edge of the old river Darios. A single note held until the player's breath gave out. The sound, it was believed, told the frost the people still remembered how to be quiet. And for that, the frost might offer another day, not more. Just one more. That was enough. In this new world, love changed. It was no longer fire and storm. It became proximity. To sit with another, unmoving, breathing together beneath snow that was love. To feel another's hand beside yours in the dark, and not need to grasp it, that was love. To vanish together, without mark or noise, that was union. Birth was not celebrated. Death was not mourned. Both were considered movements of warmth, and therefore dangerous. What mattered was presence and absence, and the precise dance between them. And still, sometimes, the cold came. Sometimes, whole families froze in their sleep, fingers touching. Sometimes, villages vanished in a single breath of wind, and no one asked why. Because asking made sound, and sound was still a risk, but not a fear. Not anymore. Fear had melted, left behind. The people who remained were not brave. They were not resigned. They were simply shaped to fit the cold, like water and stone, like wind through reeds. And in that shape, they waited, not for spring. Spring was a mem, Ori now, but for something else. A moment, a shift, a silence so deep, it would erase even the frost. And in that silence, perhaps, the first true warmth. They had no names, no need for them. In the time after forgetting became fire and silence became survival, whole settlements emerged that never spoke, never marked territory, never carved symbols into stone. These were not villages in the traditional sense. No walls, no roads, no squares, just space and presence. people who had learned to live without appearing. They were known only by those who left them, and even then, only in breathless gestures. One such settlement, somewhere between the cliffs of Argolis and the forests no longer mapped, was called by traders the place that moves. Not because it changed location, but because its boundaries were made of footsteps. The people never stayed still long enough for snow to settle. They moved in slow circles, each loop like a spiral drawn by feet and breath. Their homes were temporary, not tents, not huts, but structures made of snow and shadow, erased each morning, rebuilt each dusk. They believed that permanence was scent, and scent drew frost. So nothing remained, nothing lingered. They ate what the cold gave: bark, roots, creatures already frozen. They cooked only with stones warmed in silence beneath bodies. They slept not fully, but partially enough to dream without forgetting where they were. And they sang, not music, not melody, but long, breathless hums that rose into the trees and vanished. The hums were not for them, they were for the frost, a kind of lullaby not to please it but to warn it. We are already still. You need not still us more. In another place, farther north, closer to the mountains once thought sacred, existed the hollow grove, a forest where trees grew in rings, and inside the rings, no snow fell. The people there did not build. They curled into the bark, letting their body temperatures drop until even wolves ignored them. Their children were born with translucent skin, not ill, just unfinished, as if their bodies had adapted to lightlessness, to silence, to the absence of motion. These children never cried, not once. Instead, they stared at snowflakes as they fell, memorizing patterns, blinking only when the sky turned red at dusk. The elders of Hollow Grove, if they could be called that, trained the young in stillness, the way others once trained in dance or swordplay. A twitch was a lesson, a breath too fast, a correction. By age 7, most could lie beneath snow for hours without heartbeat detectable. Their reward was not praise, it was coldness shared, a communal silence that wrapped around them like a second skin. In the ruins of what might once have been Thebes, a third kind of settlement formed or perhaps emerged. These were called the Drifted, not because they wandered, but because no one could say when they began. They lived beneath ground, in old aqueducts and cisterns, but not to hide, simply because sound traveled differently there. They communicated with pressure fingers against stone, the shifting of weight. Their entire language was built on rhythm and pause. A person could say a whole history with one step against a wall, and yet they told no stories. They only marked presence. I am here. You are there. We are still. Those were the only messages needed. The Drifted wore layers of threadbare fabric, not for warmth, but for soundproofing. They covered their mouths not to silence words there were none, but to stop breath from echoing. Once a year, they emerged to walk the ruins, tracing the edges of buildings with their palms. It was not ritual. It was apology. Not to gods, to cold. And the frost, for reasons no one could explain, avoided the aqueducts that year. Across all these settlements, and others barely known, barely seen there, emerged a new kind of humanity. One that did not name itself, that did not wish to grow, that did not pray, or fear, or even dream in ways we would recognize. Instead, it listened. It mirrored. It adapted to cold not as threat, but as inheritance. In that adaptation, some began to change. Not visibly, there were no wings, no gills, no glowing eyes. The change was subtle. The ability to slow the pulse at will, to darken the eyes against glare, to hear the pressure of frost before it arrived, to walk on snow without sinking, to move through blizzards without leaving tracks. These changes were not taught. They appeared, slowly, generation by generation, until what was once human became something else. Not monstrous, not divine, just parallel. Evolution born not of selection but of surrender. The old world still existed far to the south, in warmer lands where frost never reached, where cities still argued and festivals still burned. But even there, the stories changed. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of the still ones, of those who had no heat. Children played games pretending to be the silent people, holding their breath in snow, eyes open, mouths closed. Parents watched with unease, because even far from the cold, the shape of it remained, the idea of it, the echo. And in time, even the southern cities began to adopt the stillness. Fireplaces burned less, voices softened, songs slowed, memory dimmed, and the frost came less often, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer needed. Silence had done its work. Stillness had prepared the world. The final transformation came not with snow, but with wind. 1 year, across every known settlement, from coast to cliff to cave, the wind changed. It blew not from the north or east, but from within, as if the earth itself exhaled. The people did not react. They did not flinch. They paused, listened, and in unison, they sat. Every village, every cave, every grove, as one. Not because they had been told, not because they believed, but because something inside them, colder than bone, older than thought, recognized the signal. The frost was no longer outside. It was in them. And they were not afraid. They were not waiting. They were not surviving. They were part of the pattern now. The warmth, where it remained, did not push against the cold. It circled it, wove around it, like breath around stillness. And the people followed. The last message ever carved into stone was found centuries later, buried beneath a collapsed tower near the sea. It was not words, just a pattern, a rhythm. Knock, knock, pause, knock. It matched the frost's arrival in the old calendar, or so the scholars say. But perhaps it was not warning. Perhaps it was greeting. Perhaps the frost knocked once, and the people, at last, knocked back. As the winds shifted once more, the cities once teeming with voices now stood silent, still, and unmoving. The people who had once breathed fire, lived in the warmth of festivals, and gathered for celebrations now walked with the stillness of ancient statues. The streets no longer echoed with footsteps but whispered, as if the earth itself was speaking in hushed tones. It was not fear that gripped them, but something deeper, something more ancient. In the absence of sound, in the absence of life, they began to see the true meaning of what they had become. They had learned to live, not with the cold, but in it. They had accepted it, not as an enemy, but as a part of their very being. The warmth of the fire, the glow of the sun, all seemed distant now, as if they had never truly existed. The frost, which once brought fear, now brought understanding. It was not something to be defeated. It was not something to be driven away. It was something that was simply there, a part of the world, a part of life. And in that acceptance, the people began to change. They no longer saw the cold as a threat. They no longer feared it. They simply became one with it. Their breath became slower. Their steps became lighter. Their hearts beat not with the pulse of life, but with the rhythm of the frost. They no longer looked for warmth. They no longer longed for the sun. They did not need it. They had the cold, and the cold had them. They no longer measured time by the seasons or the stars. They measured it by the stillness, the quiet, the absence of motion. They had learned to walk without moving, to speak without words, to live without life. And in that stillness, in that emptiness, they found something more profound than they had ever imagined. They found peace. They found the quiet rhythm of existence, the slow, steady pulse that beat in the heart of the world. And as they walked, they no longer felt the weight of their footsteps. They felt the weight of nothing. The cold was no longer cold. It was simply the absence of heat, the absence of life, the absence of everything that once defined them. And in that absence, they found freedom. A freedom that was not given to them by the gods, not bestowed upon them by fate, but a freedom they had created for themselves. They had learned to live without fear, without desire, without need. They had learned to live with the cold, with the frost, with the stillness. And in that acceptance, they had transcended the world. The last records of these people were not written. They were not spoken. They were not carved into stone or etched into clay. They were simply carried on the wind. The wind that had once been a harbinger of death now carried the whispers of their names. The names that had been forgotten in the silence. The names that had been erased by the cold. They were no longer needed. The cold had taken them, but it had also given them something else, peace. In the end, the cold did not conquer them. It did not destroy them. It did not erase them. It simply became them, and they became the cold. The final winter did not come with a roar or a storm. It came with silence, a silence so complete that even the wind could not penetrate it. The frost, the snow, the ice, they all faded into the quiet, and with them, the last traces of those who had once walked the earth. But their essence remained, not in memory, not in myth, but in the stillness that had become the world. The world did not end. It did not cease. It simply changed. The sun still rose, but it no longer brought warmth. The wind still blew, but it no longer carried sound. The cold still came, but it no longer brought fear. And in that quiet, the earth rested. It had learned to listen. It had learned to be still. It had learned to be the cold. And as the world turned, as the seasons shifted, the cold remained. Not a force to be reckoned with, not a power to be defeated, but a presence to be understood. The frost still kissed the land. The wind still whispered through the trees, and the silence still reigned. And in that silence, the people had found peace. Not the peace of warmth, not the peace of light, but the peace of stillness. And in that peace, they had found the true meaning of life, not to live, not to survive, but to simply be. And so, as the world turned and the cold remained, the people continued to walk. They did not walk towards something. They did not walk away from anything. They simply walked, as they had always walked, in the rhythm of the frost, in the silence of the wind, in the peace of the cold. And in that walk, they found eternity. Because eternity is not measured by time. It is measured by stillness, by the absence of need, by the quiet rhythm of existence. And that was all they needed, all they had ever needed. And as they walked, they were free. There were some who remembered, not clearly, not with certainty, but with something deeper, a memory beneath memory, older than the frost and slower than the wind. These were the elders, if that word still meant anything. They did not speak of warmth. They did not name it, but in their breath was a hesitation, a ripple that hinted at days when the sun held still and did not vanish behind gray skies. They did not walk like the others. Their steps held weight, not in their bodies, but in the space behind them, as if every footprint pulled shadows of forgotten seasons to the surface. These elders, wanderers of the in-between, had begun to collect silence. Not the way one collects stories, but the way stone collects lichen. Slowly, in layers, and in their presence, the cold paused. Not out of fear, out of recognition. One such elder, called nothing by those around her, had once been known, though she no longer remembered the sound of that knowing. Her feet were wrapped in cloth that no longer unraveled. Her eyes never closed. Her voice had not been used in decades. Yet within her lungs was a shape waiting to be spoken. She moved from cave to cave, settlement to grove, and where she paused, the frost slowed. Not melted, never melted, but softened, like breath on the edge of glass. In her presence, others did not ask questions, but they lingered longer, blinked slower, touched her skin not for comfort, but to feel the texture of memory. And when she departed, they followed the shape she left in the snow, as if reading words written in reverse. She once sat beside a child, born in absolute silence. No cry, no breath, only eyes. The child placed their hand on her chest, and she wept, not from sorrow, from echo. That night, the frost receded 1/2 mile without wind, and no one recorded why. In another region, a wind plateau above the edge of the old Peloponnesian ridge, lived a man with no voice but countless names. Every settlement had called him something different. The holder of quiet, the windless one, the walker through still breath. He lived atop a tower, carved into mountain stone, open to the sky, where snow fell sideways. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He simply sat, and the cold bent around him. Some believed he had once been a firekeeper in a time when flames still told stories, that he had buried his last ember beneath the summit and forgotten how to ask for it back. Others believed he had never spoken because he had never been born, only carved, like the statues of forgotten gods, into silence. One night, a traveler climbed the ridge to meet him. She carried salt in her palms, an ancient offering once used to remind the body of tears. When she reached the summit, he turned to her for the first time in anyone's memory. He did not smile, but the wind shifted. She placed the salt on his chest and whispered, "Do you remember?" He did not answer. But the next morning, birds returned to the lower cliffs for the first time in decades. Tiny, shivering, lost but singing. The songs made no sense. No one recognized the melodies, but the rhythm was familiar. Not warm, not alive, just remembered. And in that rhythm, stories awoke. Not the old ones, not the gods, or the myths, or the epics of men, but stories of breath, of how it felt to exhale without seeing it vanish, of how it sounded to wake with birdsong rather than frost crack, of how the sky once looked in reflection not gray, but azure, deep enough to drown in. These memories did not return to the world all at once. They seeped like thaw through the cracks of silence. A child asking what green meant, an elder humming in their sleep, a woman reaching for a bowl of water and flinching when it was warm. These were not rebellions. They were reminders. And the frost eternal watchful did not strike. It observed, measured, tilted. Something was shifting. Deep beneath the snow, rivers stirred. Not melted, not loud, just moving. Stones once sealed by ice grew damp at the edges. Roots, long forgotten, twitched in dreamless tension. And in one cave so far north it had no name, a pool of water remained unfrozen. Not hot, not alive, but waiting. Some believed it was the last tear shed by the world before winter came. Others said it was not water at all, but memory in liquid form, and that those who drank it would remember not warmth, but the cost of forgetting. No one dared test it. Yet its presence changed the air. People who approached the cave left lighter, not happier, not safer, just aware. Aware that the cold, however vast, was not the only truth, that before the frost there had been something else, and that perhaps, just perhaps, it could be named again. In the south, where frost lingered only in shadow, the old ruins of Olympia stood cracked and hollow. Yet among the broken columns, moss had returned. Not vibrant, not lush, but green nonetheless. One day, a child placed their hand upon it and gasped, not from heat, from memory. And that night, They whispered to their mother. I saw the color of stories. The mother did not understand, but she nodded. Because the whisper had been soft, and the frost had not stirred, more and more, the world began to ripple. Not visibly, not immediately, but undeniably, like a breath long held, beginning to release. The cold did not retreat. It had no need, but it made space, in gaps, in pauses, in the moments between silence and stillness, as if testing the world's memory, as if asking, what did you lose? And the people, in their own quiet ways, began to answer. Not with sound, not with fire, but with presence, with eyes lifted to sky, with steps that left traces, with hands that held warmth a moment longer than needed. They did not demand spring. They did not summon it. But they remembered. And sometimes, memory is enough. They gathered without gathering. They assembled without intention. No horns were sounded. No fires lit. No banners raised. It began with eyes meeting across snow-covered fields, hands brushing against the same stone, breath forming the same rhythm in the cold. A new kind of movement emerged, not loud, not organized, but resonant. Across settlements, caves, and wind-worn cliffs, people paused more often, looking toward the sky not in prayer, but in remembrance. They stood a little longer in places they had once passed through. They lingered at the edges of frozen streams, as if listening for an echo that never came or perhaps one that had never left. In the village once called the Curve, where homes were built into the sides of hills and masked by frost-laced moss, a woman began drawing circles in the snow each morning. At first, no one noticed. The snow covered them again by midday, but she returned every dawn to draw them anew. Not perfect, not symmetrical, just circles. After the 9th day, others joined, not to help, not to question, but to draw. Soon the hills shimmered each morning with soft arcs and spirals, erased by the wind and reborn again at sunrise. They called it keeping the breath of the ground. Elsewhere, in a cavern whose ceiling still shimmered with remnants of ancient mineral light, a child began humming. Not a song, exactly just a note, a vibration. Every night, before sleep, the same hum. Others started to harmonize, layering quiet on quiet, until the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The frost lingered at the mouth of the cave, but never entered. On the southern edge of the old Delphic ridge, where the oracle's words had once echoed beneath marble columns, someone began stacking stones. Not high, not wide, just 2 at a time, one for memory, one for forgetting. The formations spread. No one touched them. They simply appeared. And in the silence between stone and stone, people began to walk slower, to step in rhythm, not because they remembered why, but because something in their bones moved with the stones. In the western drylands, a place so wind-scarred that even snow hesitated to linger, a boy drew a face in the dust, not of someone he knew, not of any god, just a face human, simple, incomplete, and beside it, he etched the word before. He didn't know what it meant, but when his grandmother saw it, she wept without tears, her breath curling into the word until the dust lifted and vanished. In the far north, where cold was not season but element, people began to share warmth, not through fire, through nearness. They sat close again, leaned shoulder to shoulder, held hands not for need, but to measure memory. It was awkward at first. The cold had taught them to avoid touch to survive alone. But the longer they remained near, the less the frost pressed inward, as if watching, as if remembering too. One night, across all known regions, the sky shifted. No stars appeared, no moon. Only a faint glow, not aurora, not light, but memory given color. It pulsed in long waves, soft as thought, and those who saw it stopped speaking for days. When they finally did, their voices trembled with echoes they did not understand. Not pain, not joy, just recognition. The cold did not answer, but it did not retreat, and that was enough. In a canyon cut deep through marble, long frozen and silent, a wind returned. It did not howl, it did not sting, it whispered. The people who lived nearby gathered, not at its center, but at its edges. They listened. Not for words, there were none, but for patterns. They began to breathe with the wind, and the canyon, once thought dead, began to echo, faintly, as if remembering the shape of sound. In the east, near a sea no longer named, a group of elders began walking each morning to the same stone. They placed nothing upon it, spoke no prayers. They simply touched it, one by one, then stood in silence until the last had gone. No one asked why. But soon, travelers began arriving, not to worship, to witness. And after each gathering, the frost thinned a little more along the coast. They called it the thawing place. Though no thaw came, just pause, stillness with intent. And that was all they needed. In time, a new kind of silence spread. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of survival. A shared quiet, one that welcomed memory, that held breath not in dread but in hope. Children born into this silence did not cry, but they looked longer. They touched more often. They slept curled against others. And sometimes, when the wind was gentle, they laughed, softly, without sound. But the motion was unmistakable. Laughter, like thaw, does not begin with heat. It begins with permission. And now, the world was beginning to grant it. The frost did not vanish. It remained, steady, vast, eternal. But it no longer pressed, no longer erased. It observed. It learned. Perhaps, even, it felt. For if humans could remember warmth without needing it, then perhaps the cold could remember loss without punishing it. And in that exchange, silent, slow, sacred, something shifted. Not in the heavens, not in the ground, in the space between, that thin place where breath meets air, where thought becomes motion. In that place, the world began again, quietly, together. They did not know when the silence had become ritual. It had not been declared. There were no words for it, but across the frostbitten world, movements began to repeat. Hands raised at the same hour each day. Stones tapped 3 times before entering shelters. Snow cleared in spirals, not lines. And every dusk, bodies faced west, not to call for the sun, but to remember that it once returned. No one taught this, yet it spread. Through glance and echo, through breath held longer than comfort required, through the brief touch of palms before parting. It was not coordinated, it was remembered. In the caves of the north, families began to press their foreheads together before sleep, not for warmth, for alignment, so that dreams, if they came, might arrive in unison. In the southern valleys, where wind no longer roared but sighed, women walked barefoot on the frozen ground each morning, whispering names they didn't know were names. Some were old gods, some were trees, some were colors no longer seen. The ice never cracked beneath them. In the east, children built towers from brittle twigs, each tower exactly 7 branches high. If a wind knocked one down, it was not rebuilt. But no one stopped building. They did not know what the towers meant. Only that when one stood intact for 9 days, those nearby began to remember smells of smoke, of olives, of rain. These fragments returned like flakes of ash, fragile and precise. One boy stood outside his shelter and asked, "What is the word for the thing that makes you feel full in your chest, but not in your stomach?" No one answered. But the next night, 4 people gathered beside him and placed their hands on their chests, not in mimicry, in memory. Elsewhere, far into the west where stone met sea, someone began etching lines into cliffs. Not letters, not images, just lines. Long ones, short ones, each ending abruptly, as if the cliff itself had forgotten how to continue. Over time, wind filled the lines with snow, forming grooves that shimmered in moonlight. The people called them veins of the earth, and when standing among them, some claimed to feel warmth beneath their feet. No one verified this, but every seventh night, the cliffs hummed. Not sound, not vibration, just presence, as though something ancient was taking notice. In a dry place where frost formed only once a season, a woman began sleeping outside. When asked why, she said, "The cold listens better than walls do." After 14 days, her hair turned silver, though her face remained young. She no longer spoke, but when she walked, birds followed. Even those thought extinct. North of the old temples, where the bones of forgotten statues poked through snow like ribs, a group of men began to chant. Not words, breath, rhythmic, rising and falling like waves, with no source and no end. The chant continued, even when they paused, carried by the wind, echoed by stone. One child repeated it into the palm of her hand and claimed she could feel it respond. She began wrapping her palms in cloth at night to keep the echoes warm. In the ruins of a once great library, beneath frost-covered pillars, someone stacked shards of ice into shelves, each shard engraved with a single motion: a hand raised, a foot stepping forward, a head turning left. They called it the choreography of the forgotten. And each time a new shard was placed, the air thickened, as though remembering how it once moved. These rituals did not end the winter, they did not call back the sun, but something in the frost began to shift. A pause in the wind where none had been, a delay in the settling of snow, a softness at dawn that wasn't warmth but the memory of it. In the deep desert, where nothing had grown in a generation, green lichen appeared on one rock. The people gathered, but did not touch. They bowed their heads and breathed together, 1,000 lungs moving as one. The lichen spread, just a little, enough. They did not speak of it, not out of fear, but reverence. In the farthest reaches of the eastern ridges, where the cold bled into stars, someone sang. No one heard it directly, but that night, a frozen stream began to flow beneath the ice. It did not crack. It did not spill. It simply moved. A hum beneath islands, an agreement. The cold was still vast, still eternal, but it was no longer alone. It had been seen. It had been honored. And now, it listened. One morning, across the known lands, people awoke with the same dream. Not vivid, not detailed. Just a feeling of heat without burning, of light without blinding, of breath that tasted of soil and wind and orange fruit. And in the dream, a word, not spoken, understood. It had no equivalent in any tongue. But when they woke, people looked at each other and nodded. They had felt the same. The next night, they built a fire. Not for survival, for story. They placed their hands around it and did not speak. The fire cracked. Sparks rose, and for the first time in countless years, someone laughed aloud. Just once. Short, startling, but real. No one silenced him. Instead, a woman stood and clapped her hands twice. A child danced. An elder wept, and the frost, which had always devoured fire, did not descend. It watched, observed, shifted. In a cave on the edge of the sea, someone painted, not with pigment, with melted snow. They traced shapes from memory, not of what had been seen, but what had been felt. A shape like the ache behind the eyes, another like the breath before speech, another like the warmth of a palm in winter. The snow darkened the stone, and when it evaporated, the marks remained, not visibly. But when others entered the cave, they gasped, as if touched. In the great hollow of the mountains, beneath a sky with no stars, hundreds gathered. They brought nothing, said nothing. They sat, for hours, breathing, being. The frost thickened around them, then stilled, and in the center of the hollow, a flower bloomed, white, silent, fragile. They did not touch it, but each left something: a breath, a tear, a fingerprint. And for the first time since winter began, the earth exhaled. They did not rise in revolution. They did not build monuments or write declarations. The cold had not lifted, and no spring had come. But something changed in how they stood. Their backs were no longer bent beneath the sky. Their eyes no longer sought permission to remember. They had begun to move in ways that meant more than survival. In the village of the Curve, once hidden beneath moss, and now bare to the wind, people began to walk without destination. Each morning, a few would step beyond the circle of their settlement, not to hunt, not to flee, but to wander. They called it carrying the breath forward. And when they returned, sometimes hours later, sometimes days, they carried with them stones, branches, ice, wind. But more than that, they carried new silence. A silence that did not fear the frost, that stood beside it, equal. In the place once known as Delphi, where the echoes of God still clung to stone like mist, a woman built a path from frost-marked leaves. She laid them end to end, spiraling outward from a broken altar. People followed the path barefoot, eyes closed, arms at their sides. And when they reached the end, they stood still until the wind shifted. Then they returned. No one spoke during the walk, but afterward, laughter came easier. Not loud, but open. On a plateau where nothing had grown in a century, a boy began carving circles into the bark of a frozen tree. The tree did not live, but the bark responded. Each circle stayed warm for hours. The boy said nothing, but others joined. Soon, the tree shimmered with overlapping circles, not glowing, not pulsing, just warmer than the wind. People came to place their hands on it and breathe. It became known as the listening tree. In the far western basin, where the stars felt close enough to touch, a group began gathering stones into spirals too large to see from the ground. They worked in silence, moving through snow, placing each stone by feel. At the center of each spiral, they left one candle, unlit. They said the candle was not for fire but for memory, that someday the sun would find it. In the high north, where the frost never melted and the wind never stopped, a child began to dance, not for joy, not for warmth, but for rhythm. Each step thudded into the snow, slow and deliberate. At first, the frost ignored her. Then, one night, the wind stopped for 7 heartbeats, and the stars flickered, just once. She kept dancing every night. Soon others joined. They called it walking the shape of sound. And though the wind returned, it no longer howled as fiercely. It curved around them. In the ruins of a city long swallowed by ice, someone painted, not with color, with movement. They dragged cloth across walls, sweeping in great arcs, then small spirals. The motion left no mark visible to the eye, but when people stood near, they felt moved, as if the walls remembered being walls, as if the city, long dead, was trying to speak through gesture. These motions became prayer, not to gods, to memory. In scattered places, people began planting seeds, not in soil, in snow. They knew nothing would grow, but they planted anyway. And when the snow did not cover the seeds, they whispered thanks, not because they believed the seeds would bloom, but because something had chosen to watch over them. That was enough. In the dry lands, where the wind had scoured the skin from stone, two men began tracing shadows. At dusk, they followed each other's silhouettes across the plain, carving their outlines into sand, then watching the night erase them. Each morning, they returned and began again. When asked why, one said, "Because the frost forgets what we look like." In the canyon of birds, once empty, now alive with wing beats, a child whistled a note that summoned echoes from the cliffs. The note made no sense, held no tone, but each time it was sounded, frost melted from one feather. The people began to collect these feathers, not as trophies, as offerings. They left them in hollowed stones beside their homes, and the stones grew warmer. In the south, beneath frozen vines, a group of women began spinning thread, not from wool, from bark, from frost-bitten leaves, from air. The threads broke easily, but they kept spinning, binding them together with silence. One night, they tied a length of thread around the wrist of a dying elder. He slept for the first time in days, and in the morning he whispered, "I dreamed in color." They wrapped the thread around his chest and sang. The frost crept to the edge of the room and stopped. Across the lands, people began to hum, not in unison, not with tune, but with purpose. Humming became breath. Breath became anchor. Anchor became root. And the frost, which had once consumed all sound, began to ripple, as if drawn toward the warmth without knowing why. In one forgotten place, a pool that had never frozen began to glow, not with fire, with memory. Those who touched it claimed they saw faces not of people, but of moments. A door closing, a hand lifted, a voice lost. They wept not from grief, from recognition. And when they returned to their villages, the frost felt softer against their skin. The cold did not fade, but it began to match them. Step for step, silence for silence, breath for breath. It no longer dictated, it listened. In the hollow beneath the ancient oak, now petrified, now revered, someone buried a heartbeat. Not a heart, not flesh, just a stone that pulsed in rhythm with the world. They said nothing, but when others came near, their own hearts aligned. They called it the stone of us. Not the stone of hope, not of gods, of us. The frost lingered at the edges, curious. It did not enter, but neither did it retreat. That night the stars shimmered twice, and someone, somewhere, smiled without reason. They did not hope for spring. They did not ask for light, but they had learned to be more than survivors. They were listeners, movers, rememberers, and now they were builders of quiet, of breath, of future. They began to build, not from memory, but from something deeper, not structures of stone or wood, but of intention. Where once they had traced the outlines of loss, now they stepped into the act of forming without precedent. They did not rebuild what had fallen. They created what had never existed. It started small. In a clearing where frost had never melted, 5 people gathered. They brought nothing, wore no colors, spoke no names. But when they placed their palms upon the frozen ground and closed their eyes, they began to sway, not in rhythm with each other, but with something beneath. The sway grew slower, more deliberate. A resonance passed through them, and the frost cracked not apart, but open. Beneath it was not soil, not stone, just warmth. Not enough to melt, but enough to be known. They called the place First Tremor, though none could say why. In the ridge where no echo had ever returned, a woman placed a bowl of ice at the center of a broken amphitheater. Each morning it remained unmelted. Each night she sang above it. No words, just tone. On the 13th day, the ice glowed faintly. By the 21st, it hummed. Visitors came not to witness, but to sit in silence. Eventually, others brought their own bowls. The hum spread. One bowl cracked, and a boy touched the shard to his chest. He said he felt the color blue not as sight, but as emotion. They began calling it bluing. Elsewhere, beneath the petrified limbs of what had once been an olive grove, a man drew figures into the snow, not of people, not of animals, but of feelings. Grief with a hunched back, joy with an open neck, regret with one hand turned inward. He lay among them and whispered, "You are mine." The next morning, one figure remained not in snow, but in shadow. It followed him. Others tried drawing their own. Some succeeded. The shadows never harmed, but they moved with their humans, mirroring not steps but states. A new language of posture and light. In the valley of the three winds, where frost once cut the skin of air, a structure appeared. No one built it, or if they did, none lamed it. It was not a building. It had no doors, no roof, just walls arranged in curves that caught the wind and turned it into whisper. Those who stood inside heard stories, not spoken, not imagined, but remembered. Stories that had never belonged to them yet lived in their bones. A woman left the structure with tears on her palms. She pressed her hands into snow. The melt revealed black stone beneath. The stone pulsed. They named it Listening's Edge. In a forgotten glade far north, people began to sleep on mirrors of ice. Not for reflection, for connection. The ice did not show their faces, but their movements in dream. One man rolled from side to side all night. In the morning, the ice beneath him was patterned in spirals. He said, "I walked a long way." A child slept without motion. In the morning, the ice showed a flower. The frost did not return to that glade. Not in full. It hovered, uncertain. In the places where people gathered most often, they began to trace runes with breath alone. Exhalations formed symbols that vanished as quickly as they came. Yet those who stood nearby could feel their meaning. One breath said, "Wait." Another said, "Follow." Another simply said, "You." The runes could not be recorded, but they lingered in muscle, in bone. The people began moving differently, as though written into the air. In the ruins of an observatory, beneath a sky void of stars, someone built a circle of glass. Not to look outward, to look within. When one stood in its center, memories surfaced. Not theirs. Others. A man saw the death of a girl with orange ribbons. A woman saw the birth of a bird from flame. A child saw the face of someone who had never lived. They left tokens behind a stone, a hair, a breath. Over time, the glass dimmed, but those who entered still wept. In the deep south, near the place where frost never reached, the air began to carry tone. Not music, not noise, but pure resonance. People heard notes when they touched certain trees, when they stepped in certain ways, when they held silence too long. A new awareness dawned, one not tied to sound, but vibration. They began to build paths based on tone, not destinations, but frequencies. Walking them changed thought. Some said it healed. Others said it rewrote. In a high plain where snow came once each year, a child found a hollow bone. It sang when held, not aloud within. The song changed each day. She began bringing it to others, letting them hear their own songs. A man screamed when he heard his. A woman danced. The child never spoke, but the world followed her. The bone broke after 50 days. She buried it. A tree grew. That tree never held frost. In the darkest part of the known world, a cave formed from breath. No one carved it. It coalesced. Its walls exhaled in rhythm with the hearts of those who entered. People brought nothing inside. They left with eyes closed and hands trembling. Some claimed to have heard names. Others heard only themselves. The cave's breath matched the wind for miles. It became a pulse in the landscape, a living quiet. These were not inventions. They were emergences. Formless things made form by attention. The people did not worship them. They met them as equals. The frost watched all this, not withdrawn, not vengeful, curious. Its edge softened, its voice quieted. Where it once consumed, it now observed. Some said the frost wept, others said it waited. One night, across all lands, a light appeared, not in the sky, in water, every pool, every stream, every hollow filled with glow. Not bright, gentle. The people approached, did not touch. They sat, for hours, in silence, listening to the shimmer. It did not speak, but something passed between it and them. A recognition. The next morning, frost remained. But in places where it touched skin, people no longer shivered. They sighed. And for the first time, the cold felt like home. They did not intend to change the cold. They did not think themselves capable of such a thing. But the structures they made, the breath-shaped words and rhythm-built places, began to press against the silence in ways even the frost could not ignore. Where once the world had been a flat circle of cold permanence, something now trembled beneath the surface. A response. In the northmost ridge, a cave began to sing, not with voice, with pressure, a hum in the bones. Those who approached it slowed. Their limbs obeyed a new gravity, not heavy aware. Inside, the walls pulsed faintly. A woman placed her hand upon one and whispered, "I'm listening." The hum deepened. Her heartbeat matched. She remained there for 3 days. When she returned, her skin held a shimmer that neither light nor time could erase. The cave's hum continued, echoing through stone into the snow above. In the hollow where breath once froze on contact, air began to swirl in patterns, not wind, motion, coherent, predictable only in retrospect. When tracked over time, the swirls formed shapes, long-forgotten glee, PHS from no known language. The people called them ghost letters. They watched them move across valleys, trailing behind deer and smoke. When one passed through a person, they dreamed of warm rain, even those who had never known such a thing. On the plain of ash, where footsteps once vanished instantly, tracks now lingered. A single print could remain for days. Not fossilized, remembered. Children began leaving stories in steps. Hop, pause, spin, retreat. Elders read them like tales, weeping at the meanings. This one remembers a brother. This one dreams of flight. One morning, a trail of prints ended in a spiral, and within it bloomed frost, shaped like an eye. Not human, but watching. In the west, where cliffs once reflected only their own bleakness, they now shimmered at dusk, as if the rock had learned to capture the light, even when the sun refused to rise. Artists gathered, tracing outlines with smoke, then pressing their faces to the stone. They emerged, altered not visibly, but in gait, in gaze. One woman claimed she saw through frost, not past it. "It's not a wall," she said. "It's a veil." In the cavernous heart of a buried temple, voices returned. Not echoes, choruses, but no one spoke them. When people stepped inside, they heard harmonies shaped like questions. Answers, apologies, none their own, all true. A man entered with clenched fists and left humming. A child entered weeping and emerged silent, smiling. The temple's stone floor glowed faintly when wet with tears. In the far east, beneath the layered ruins of 10 forgotten villages, an orb rose from the ground, smooth, featureless, silent, but it bent light and breath around it. Those who stood near felt weightless, not in body, but in thought. Ideas moved without effort. Dreams surfaced in clarity. One girl touched the orb and spoke a word in a language no one knew. Frost nearby began to drip. It did not melt, it released. In the grove where frost never left the trees, leaves returned. Not green, not living, formed of air and memory, transparent, swaying to rhythms not of wind, but of heartbeat. When one leaf fell, the person who caught it remembered a moment not their own, a birth, a choice, a promesse kept in secret. The leaves became currency not of trade, but of meaning. In the city of silent bells, long buried in permafrost, sound returned. Not from metal, from space itself. Each intersection, each threshold, rang faintly when crossed. The tones varied, soft, warm, each one tuned to the person passing. A man stepped through a once doorway and heard his mother's breath. A woman passed beneath a fallen arch and heard waves. Children learned to walk with purpose, to seek the notes that sang most clearly. The bells never rusted, they never stopped. On a barren ridge with no name, a boy painted shadows onto the snow. He used soot and silence. The shadows stayed. They moved when he slept. When he awoke, they were story scenes from a life he did not live, but somehow belonged to. People came to lie beside the shadows, dreaming with eyes open. The frost recoiled at first, then drew closer, and rested in the underwater ruin of a temple none remembered. Breath became solid, not ice, form. People dove in silence, holding thought rather than air. Shapes emerged from exhalation. Spirals, bridges, faces. They lasted minutes, then dissolved. But each left an imprint in the water's temperature. A record. One diver swam through 3 shapes and woke speaking a name that no one knew but everyone wept upon hearing. In places where the cold had been deepest, it now pulsed. A rhythm, not unlike breath, not unlike thought. The frost no longer crept. It paused, chose, responded. It settled only where welcome. It lifted when rejected. It curled beside those who shared warmth. It learned, people noticed, and honored. They carved seats into the ice and left them empty. They drew paths for the frost to follow, curved, soft, winding, and the frost obeyed, not as servant, as partner. In one final act, a gathering formed. Across the land, without summons or speech, people began to move toward the center. They brought nothing, said nothing. The journey took days, weeks. Some arrived barefoot, some carried breath in jars, some wore only thread. When they reached the valley, the one untouched since the first winter, they circled its rim and faced inward. The frost watched. A hum began. No voice, no sound, just vibration. Shared, carried, matched. And in the valley's center, light rose. Not fire, not sun. Memory, condensed. All that had been made, lost, remembered, shared. It pulsed once, twice, then faded. Not gone, given. The frost bowed, not literally, but undeniably. And in that moment, the cold changed. Forever. Not vanished, not defeated. Changed. It would still return. It would still cover and claim, but never again alone, never again unspoken. It had been witnessed. It had been loved. They no longer waited for the frost to pass. They moved with it, among it, as though it had always been theirs to speak with. But as they shifted, so too did the cold. Where once it had lingered in corners and pressed into lungs, now it rolled in slow pulses, like breath beneath water. The cold had memory now, not just of what had been, but of what was becoming. In the northern ridges where no paths had ever held, people awoke to find lines in the frost. Not footprints, not animal tracks, lines, etched with precision, forming arcs that connected one rise to another. They glowed faintly at dawn, then disappeared. A woman followed one for 3 days. It led her to a field of ice shaped like eyes. She stood in their center, and the wind died. She whispered nothing. Still, something answered. In the southeast, where the breath-shaped prayers had once lingered in air, The frost began to echo them back, not in sound, in sensation. A person would exhale a shape, and the cold would curl around it, caress it, sometimes dissolve it, sometimes return it warmer. These echoes had no logic, but they held meaning. When a child exhaled 3 circles and the frost returned to spiral, he wept. When his mother did the same and the frost stayed still, she held him for hours. Across the Central Plains, once windswept and dead, frost began growing upward. It rose, not in spikes, but in spirals, concentric, expanding, silent. People built their shelters around them, never touching the formations. In time, the spirals shifted, tracking not the sun, but emotion. They leaned toward grief, curled around joy, danced with silence. One night, all the spirals leaned toward the same hill. In the morning, a woman emerged from that hill and whispered, "It's listening." In the village once known for its glass bells, frost began to sing. Not every day, only at dusk. It hummed in doorways, murmured across window edges. Each note was brief, like the pluck of a string remembered from a dream. One family recorded the tones by shaping them into snow. They built small towers that only stood for moments before melting, and each time they did, a new tone emerged. They called them frost chords. Travelers sought these towers, kneeling as they vanished. Some claimed to feel heat, others, memory. In the farthest western cliffs, the cold stopped falling. Not warmth, just stillness. A soft pause. Frost hovered inches above stone, unmoving. People climbed the cliffs to feel the space between, placing their hands beneath the floating chill. It did not burn. It trembled. An elder passed her hand through and gasped. She said she had touched her sister's breath. A man reached through and felt nothing, but wept for hours. In the deep hollows below the wind plains, frost began to hum with thought, not words, not images, just thought, a presence. People entered the hollows and stood still. When they left, some could not explain what had changed, but they walked slower, looked longer. One girl refused to speak for days after leaving the hollow. Then she drew a map of the world no one had seen, filled with warm rivers and golden trees. She called it, "What Frost Dreams," and the map pulsed when touched. In an abandoned temple, frost mimicked movement. When someone walked, it followed their pace. When they stopped, it paused. A dancer entered one evening, spinning slowly, lifting her arms in spirals. The frost mirrored her. Step for step, arc for arc, she danced until she collapsed, weeping with joy. She said the cold had known her before she was born, that it had waited, that now it remembered. In the cavernous ruins of the tower that once held stars, frost began to reflect light from unknown sources. Places with no sun shimmered with soft blue. Paths opened where none had existed, and at their ends pools, shallow, silent, filled not with water, but frost shaped like breath. Those who dared to kneel beside the pools felt their heartbeat slow. Some said they saw shadows of themselves within the frost. Others said they saw those who were gone. The frost offered no answers, only presence. In the flatlands once cracked by cold, people began to whisper into jars. They sealed them, placed them in snow, and waited. Weeks passed. Then one jar began to hum. Another trembled. A third cracked, releasing a glow like sigh. No one knew why some jars responded, but all began to whisper into them anyway. These became known as frost messengers. In time, one child opened a jar that whispered back. It said a single word: stay. The frost near that child never touched him again. In the southern ridges where no echo had ever lived, frost began to echo not sound, but pulse. Footsteps left behind a soft throb in the air. When people gathered and walked in rhythm, The frost answered with low vibrations that settled into stone. Those stones warmed, not hot, just enough. Enough to rest against, enough to gather near. Children pressed their cheeks to them and dreamed. Elders sat and hummed. The frost pulsed with them, then without them, then foe are them. In one village, frost began to form shapes during sleep. People awoke to find spirals above their heads, loops beside their beds. One man awoke to a single word in frost on his wall. Return. He left the village that morning. No one stopped him. A week later, he came back, with stories from a place no one had seen, but everyone had dreamed. The frost near him glowed. A woman in the east spoke to the frost for 7 nights. The 8th morning, she awoke with frost braided into her hair. She could no longer speak, but everything she touched shimmered, and the frost bent toward her. When she sat, it curled beside her. When she wept, it lifted into the air, as if trying to become breath. People followed her in silence, watching the frost become her language. They began calling her First of the New. In the region where no trees had stood in memory, a frost forest appeared. Not bark, not leaf, just shape. Towering spirals of ice that grew toward the breath of sky. They made no sound, but wind did not enter. The air within the forest pulsed. Safe, soft. People entered and slept for days. No dreams, no fear, only silence. When they awoke, they carried pieces of frost within their hands that never melted. They called them shards of knowing. The frost was no longer just weather, no longer punishment, no longer reminder. It had become participant. In its silence, it held stories. In its presence, it echoed becoming. And the people, for the first time in generations, stopped fearing the long nights. They built fires not for warmth, but for sharing. They carved paths not to flee, but to invite. They stood in the frost and whispered, not for answers, but for witness. The frost listened. It answered. They stopped measuring time by the sun. Shadows no longer told stories of passing. Instead, the frost began marking the world, not with hours or days, but with echoes. One footstep could carry across a week. A breath spoken in the right silence could be heard 3 seasons later. And so the people began to listen, not to when, but to how. How a moment landed, how it lingered, how it moved even after being forgotten. In the valley of curved stone, people noticed that when they sat in circles, the wind repeated their gestures in reverse. A raised hand returned lowered. A sigh came back as a question. They began to gather at dawn, not to speak, but to be mirrored. One day, a woman reached toward the sky, and the frost beneath her feet lifted upward in a silent wave. That wave returned weeks later, brushing the cheek of a man who had never seen her. He cried, though he could not say why. Deep within the cliffs of dusk, a child discovered a line in the frost that pulsed when touched. Each pulse was slower than the last. He touched it again the next day. It did not respond. But 2 nights later, it thrummed through the entire cave, vibrating softly like the memory of a name. People came to call it the long thread. It began to hum when new children were born, and when the oldest died, the thread brightened for hours. In the far north, where time had once frozen like stone, it began to spiral. Days stretched like mist, nights shortened into seconds. People would sleep and wake to find the moon had blinked away and returned. One man aged a year in a single hour. A girl grew younger with each dream. They no longer feared it. They accepted and built markers not of stone, but of story. This is where my heart forgot its rhythm, they would say. This is where my mother remembered she had once danced. Beneath the ground, in caverns where silence ruled for generations, frost formed rings, not circles, time rings. Each ring held a moment not from the present, not from the past, but from some in between. One boy stepped inside, and saw his father laughing with someone who hadn't yet been born. Another girl stepped in and forgot her own name, but sang in a voice no one knew. The rings never repeated. They never glowed. But those who entered them emerged different. The surface of things changed. In towns built atop buried cities, clocks stopped. Not broken, just irrelevant. Time no longer held shape. So people began to measure existence by frostfall. This was before the quiet frost. I met her during the golden breath. He left after the frost held the moon. No two memories aligned, but no one minded. In the southern edges of the known world, the cold began to fold space. A hill walked toward its reflection. A river bent backward. One path took 4 steps forward and 5 back. People discovered that sleeping in one direction brought old dreams. Turning east while asleep brought someone else's. One village turned its bed so everyone could drift in shared slumber. They awoke with words in unspoken languages. They didn't translate. They remembered. In the lake that reflected nothing, frost began recording motion. When someone moved too fast, they vanished for a breath. When they moved with intention, echoes of themselves lingered. A woman danced with her reflection 5 steps behind. A child raced alongside his own smile. Time unraveled, not as punishment, but as gift. A reminder that linearity was only ever a story told to keep fear at bay. Near the place where the sun last touched Earth, the frost began layering memory into ice. Walls of translucent recollection grew from snow. You could press your palm to one and feel someone else's warmth. Whisper into another and hear your own voice answer from years away. One woman placed a feather inside a memory wall. The next day, it floated out, trailing frost that spelled a name she had never spoken aloud. In the ruins where frost once forbade breath, people gathered in circles to exhale in rhythm. The cold caught their breaths and spun them slowly into strands visible, living timelines. Each line pulsed differently. Some slow, like mountains thinking. Others fast, like birds learning songs. One line wrapped around a child's neck, then unwrapped and vanished. She smiled for hours. They called these gatherings echo weaving. They didn't ask for meaning. They simply returned. In the windless cave of echoes, sound no longer faded. Whispers lingered. Laughter hovered. Sobs curled into stone. One man sang a single note each day for a month. The cave held everyone. By the end, the entire chamber trembled with song. No words, just presence. He entered one day and disappeared. His voice remained. In villages where people once marked seasons with cuts in bark or bones in jars, they now painted frost with intention. Symbols for pause, for bloom, for remembering. One symbol, a curved line with 3 dots, appeared across the land. No one knew who made it first, but everyone began seeing it in dreams. Some said it meant again, others here. In the northwest, where no sun ever rose, frost began drawing maps, not of land, but of memory. Each morning, lines curled across snow, shifting with mood and wind. One man followed a line for 3 days and found the place where he had once wished to die. It was warm now. Not with fire, with waiting. He sat there and whispered his new name. The frost circled him, pulsing. They say he never left. The frost moves through time like breath through mist. It does not hold, it reveals. People began to write with ice. Not carving, placing, laying small pieces of frost along paths, to be read not now, but later. Some messages took days to appear. Others arrived before they were made. A child found a frost-scripted word beneath her pillow. Run. She fled that morning. Hours later, the house collapsed. In the easternmost isles, the sea froze inward. Not solid, just stilled. A single drop of water held mid-air for hours. One girl placed her palm beneath it. When it fell, she aged 5 years in a blink. But she knew things no one had told her. She became a teacher of wind. In a place where time no longer held shape, they found a clock that ticked backward. It was made of frost. Each tick made someone remember a kindness they had forgotten. Each talk made them release a bitterness they didn't know they held. When it finally stopped, a child picked it up and wore it as a necklace. He said, "Now I don't forget." In a field of frost petals, people lay in circles and breathed as one. The frost rose above them in waves, not sound, not light, but memory made form. When one person remembered, the frost pulsed. When two remembered the same thing, the frost turned gold. One night, the whole field turned black. They called it the forgetting. The next day, no one spoke of it, but they held hands for hours. Time now belonged to the frost. Or perhaps it had always been that way, and only now had people learned to follow its rhythm, not to control, not to predict, but to move with. They let go of calendars, of seasons. They marked life by frost phrases between the second silence, after the shared warmth, during the unspoken. The frost became a language of time, and in learning to read it, they found that time had always loved them back. They began to understand that the frost was not just cold, not just weather, not just consequence, it was presence. It had watched them for centuries, perhaps longer, not with eyes, but with attention. It had not spoken until spoken to. It had not touched until touched with care. But now, it moved, deliberately, thoughtfully. In the region where light never lingered, the frost gathered in perfect circles, rising just above the surface of the earth like breath held between thoughts. People approached and waited. If they waited long enough, the circle would release a thread-thin, crystalline humming. One woman touched it and fell into sleep. She did not wake for 5 days. When she did, she remembered nothing but could name the future cries of her unborn children. She called it the frost's whisper. Others came to try. Some received threads. Some received nothing. The frost chose. In the northern cliffs where echoes once scattered decay leaves, the frost began shaping forms for shadows, then outlines, then bodies. They were not human, not animal. They moved like thought and stood like silence. One figure remained at the edge of a village for 7 nights. On the 8th, a child walked toward it and placed a hand against its chest. It did not move, but her frost-formed breath curled around its fingers. When she returned, she spoke a name she had never heard. The frost form bowed, then vanished. In the plains, where snow buried everything indiscriminately, the frost began to uncover, not melting, revealing. Stones shaped like hands, trees twisted into spirals, bones formed into questions. Each new shape was unearthed not with heat, but with breath. People gathered to watch the frost peel back its own secrets. They whispered thanks. The frost trembled gently in return. Along the river that once froze from edge to center, the frost reversed. It began at the heart, pulsing outward. One morning, a single blossom of frost appeared in the middle of the stream. By midday, the entire river shimmered with intricate ice lace. Each pattern was unique, yet familiar, like handwriting of someone you once loved. People followed the patterns, tracing them with fingers and tears. Some claimed they saw memories in the curves. Others said they heard songs. One man built a home on the riverbank and listened for frost hymns every morning. He said it was like being prayed to. Beneath the buried mountain, where warmth had not reached in generations, the frost formed a door, perfectly square, carved not by tool, but by patience. No one knew how long it had taken. When the door finally appeared, no one dared open it. They waited. One day, a woman touched it with a single breath. The door shimmered, then melted into mist. Inside was a chamber of frost not yet born. Shapes flickered possibilities, not facts. She stepped inside and vanished. But every winter after, a new frost formation appeared above that place, spelling one word in a language known only to the wind. In the sky, clouds once moved with wind and whim, but now the frost guided them. Paths of cold spiraled across the heavens, drawing constellations unseen by stars. At night, people gathered and followed the frost trails with their eyes, learning new stories written in motion. One girl saw a spiral, a circle, a rising line. She named it Becoming. Her village called her the Frost Reader. She never spoke again, but when she walked, the frost followed in patterns no one else could summon. In caves where time once collapsed, frost began building, not randomly, with architecture, arches that curved like questions, columns shaped like breath, domes that echoed only memory. People entered and did not speak. They walked the paths in silence, returning changed. Some wept, some laughed. One child emerged with frost braided into their hair, whispering stories of a world not yet made. In the eastern forests, trees began to hum with frost tone. The ice on their bark vibrated with low, steady notes. Not music, message. One man placed his ear against a trunk and fell asleep. He awoke with his hair turned white and his voice transformed. When he spoke, the wind stilled. When he sang, the frost curved toward him. People called him the Frost Song. He called himself a listener. On cliffs above the hollow sea, frost began reflecting not the world, but desire. Look too long, and you'd see what your heart most feared or most yearned. People visited in twos, never alone. They held hands and faced the frost together. Some returned smiling. Others never returned at all. The frost kept no records, but on certain nights, it echoed names across the water. In the abandoned city of silver stones, frost took root, not as destruction, as guide. It filled the empty buildings with Shapa spirals on ceilings, flowing symbols along floors. When the wind passed through them, the whole city sang. Not loud, just enough to remind the stones they were remembered. Children played in the frost rooms, leaving laughter in the air for others to hear. One old woman sat in the center and whispered every name she had ever loved. The frost formed those names into a dome above her, glowing softly for 3 nights before fading. In the southern lowlands, the frost began choosing. One morning, 20 people awoke with patterns on their skin light blue, delicate, shifting with mood. The patterns grew brighter when they sang, dimmed when they lied. The marked ones began to gather, moving across the land like slow fire. Wherever they stepped, the frost bent toward them. No one knew why. They didn't either, but they moved with purpose. They called themselves the Frost Touched. In the hills where breath once vanished, frost began breathing back. You'd exhale, and the air would return warm. Not hot, just enough to remind you that you mattered. Some began speaking to the frost, as if it were family. They'd sit by frost-cloaked rocks and tell stories. Some stories made the frost tremble. Others made it rise like mist. One story, about a lost mother, made the frost form hands. They cradled the storyteller until she fell asleep. In the fields where nothing had ever grown, frost began planting. Tiny formations no larger than a finger rose overnight. They held no leaves, no roots, just shape. But when held, they hummed. One boy collected them and built a path to his house. Every time someone walked it, they dreamed of warmth. His village called it the Frost Garden. They said the boy had been chosen, but he said, "I just asked." In a forgotten monastery, buried beneath 7 layers of silence, frost shaped a book. No pages, just surface. When touched, it told a story, not in words, in feeling. You'd remember something you'd never lived. You'd cry for someone you'd never met. The story changed each day, but always it ended with the same sensation. Return. The frost was no longer waiting to be understood. It moved with intention. It shaped itself according to memory, to need, to love. And in doing so, it revealed what it had always been: not absence, not punishment, but witness. The people began to build their lives not around surviving the winter, but around learning from it. They no longer asked, "When will the frost leave?" They asked, "What has it come to show?" They no longer feared the long nights. They prepared for them like one prepares for reunion. They lit no fires unless the frost permitted. They spoke in hush until the frost answered. And when it did, they listened. For the first time, truly they listened. The frost had waited, and now it spoke. They no longer waited for winter. They prepared as one might prepare for a returning friend whose silence had become part of their own heartbeat. In every village, frost became not only signal, but season of ritual. It was no longer feared. It was no longer endured. It was practiced. The practice began with breath. Entire communities gathered at dusk to inhale and exhale in time, tracing invisible patterns in the air that only frost could hold. The breath would rise and linger, forming ribbons above their heads. The oldest among them called this weaving the first song. Children traced those breath ribbons with fingers until their hands remembered shapes not taught. Soon, movement followed, not dancing, but becoming. Steps taken in circles across fresh frost would leave trails that shimmered with memory. If one stepped in rhythm, the frost would echo. If one hesitated, the path would vanish. They learned not to hurry. The frost rewarded patience. In some places, people began painting frost with their own warmth-cupped hands left spirals. Feet pressed symbols. Foreheads marked gates. No one taught these forms. They emerged. When one village discovered a shared pattern, they sent runners to others. But by the time they arrived, the next village had already drawn it. "We are not learning," they said. "We are remembering together." Across high ridges and deep valleys, entire communities adopted new calendars. Not lunar, not solar. Frost marked time was now counted in echoes, in the arrival of specific frost forms: the spiral breath, the twin curve, the three-point hush. Each had meaning. Some meant pause. Some meant promise. Some meant the frost was listening closer. People whispered wishes into their breath on such days. They didn't speak them aloud, just into the frost. And sometimes, days later, those wishes would return not as gifts, but as knowing. The knowing came in dreams, in gestures, in frost forms repeating in unexpected places. A mother might find the twin curve on her child's sleeping face. A shepherd might wake to find the spiral breath across his flock. It wasn't always kind, but it was always true. The frost was becoming mirror and guide. In the plains beyond the Stone Teeth Mountains, the frost began humming. Not audibly, but in the bones. When one stepped into the open, still air, they would feel it in their spine. A low vibration, ancient and steady. Some called it the frost's voice. Others believed it was memory itself humming back into the world. A man walked into the humming frost and never returned. A week later, his footprints appeared, leading home. No one saw him arrive, but in his home, pages were covered in frost script. No ink, just cold intention. Each word melted when read. In the coastal villages, where sea and frost met like old rivals, the tide began answering frost marks. People would draw lines in the ice before the tide rose. When the sea touched them, it froze briefly, holding the marks as if agreeing. Those marks often foretold the wind. Some foretold the next death. Others, the moment someone would fall in love. No one understood how, but everyone believed. In the center of the continent, where frost once avoided touch, it now reached. It formed bridges across rivers, staircases along cliffs, tunnels beneath snow. People didn't build anymore, they asked. They stood in silence and breathed with intention. And if their purpose was strong, the frost responded. Not always, but enough. A child once breathed at a wall of ice and it opened. Behind it, her sister stood waiting. They had never met before. In distant forests where trees no longer shed leaves, Frost grew upward, forming spires between branches. These frost spires vibrated with memory. If one leaned close, they'd hear stories not in words, but in echoes of feeling. A hunter once wept beside a spire, then returned home with no memory of violence. His family said his voice had changed, softer, truer. In the mountain passes where sunlight kissed only at solstice, Frost wrote in light. Refracted sun became symbols on snow. Entire poems flashed and vanished in seconds. Travelers began waiting hours for a single phrase. One day, a phrase lasted 10 seconds. A woman saw it and screamed with joy. She vanished into the snow. No one followed. But every year, on that day, the same phrase returns. People call it the Frost's gift. In the village of 7 drums, people no longer played music. They breathed it. Gathered in a circle, they would time their breaths until the air pulsed like a heartbeat. The frost responded by forming sound-shaped slooping patterns in the snow that resonated when touched. Children would run through them laughing. Elders walked slowly, collecting memories with every step. A boy once stepped wrong, and the frost cracked. When he returned, he said he had spoken with the first winter. It had eyes like wind and a name that could not be spoken. He no longer aged. No one questioned him. Across frozen lakes, lovers would carve messages with their feet. Some messages vanished. Others remained for weeks. The longest-lasting ones always said the same thing: stay. People read them and waited. No one knew who wrote them, but everyone knew they were meant to be read. In the great valley of layered frost, patterns once hidden began to glow. Only at night. Only if no one watched directly. People built homes facing away, learning to see with side eyes and shadows. Children became the best readers. They learned to tell stories from what they didn't look at. One child spoke nothing for a year, then recited a tale that made the valley tremble. No one remembered the tale, but everyone remembered the trembling. They built a monument of hush in her name. The frost shifted again. It began responding not only to breath and step but to silence. When villages held silence for an entire day, the frost brought warmth, not heat. Comfort. Fires burned longer. Food stayed fresh. Tears dried quicker. They called it the stilling. Once, a village tried to fake silence. They whispered beneath the hush. The frost receded. Their winter was longer than all others. They never faked again. In the caves where frost once consumed all, it now healed. People came with wounds of body, of memory, and lay still. The frost crawled over them gently, whispering in pulses. Some wounds vanished. Some remained, but no longer hurt. A man brought his broken voice. The frost covered his throat. He returned able to sing, but only in sleep. His songs told dreams of a world made of breath. In the cliffs above the hollow field, frost formed a stairway that changed with each person. Some climbed endlessly and saw nothing. Others climbed 3 steps and wept. One woman climbed and never returned. Each winter, the stair reappears for one night. People gather and choose who may ascend. Always one. Always silent. In the far south where frost had never touched, it arrived. Not violently. Like invitation. It crept into sand and stone, forming soft lines beneath stars. The people there had no word for winter. Now they had 10, and none meant fear. They learned from the frost, and the frost learned from them. It began forming spiral suns in the duna symbols of balance, not conquest. They responded with song. The frost listened and stayed. Across the land, a new understanding formed, not spoken, not declared, but lived. The frost was not weather. It was not enemy. It was presence, witness, guide. People no longer asked what the frost would do. They asked what it needed. They listened when it arrived. They offered stories, breath, stillness. The frost offered memory, shape, warmth. And in this giving, a new life began. Winter was no longer the end. It was the deep breath before becoming. They began to speak not in sentences, but in frost. The frost became a grammar, not built of words, but of waiting, of stillness, of placement. Villages no longer wrote records. They mapped frost formations. A single curve of hoarfrost near a door might mean birth. 3 nested spirals along a fence meant the return of someone thought gone. The language spread not taught, but remembered. People stopped asking, "What does this mean?" and began asking, "Where have I seen this before?" That shift changed everything. The youngest among them became the best readers. Children traced frost forms with their breath, completing unfinished meanings. An elder once watched a child form 5 perfect arcs around a stone. She gasped, then wept. "That was my grandmother's goodbye," she whispered. "I never told anyone what it looked like." The frost had heard. On mountain ledges where wind once erased all trace, now the frost etched instructions, not orders, invitations. A circle near a cliff's edge might suggest a moment of trust. 2 parallel lines beside a narrow pass might ask, "Are you walking with fear or with memory?" Travelers began pausing, responding not always correctly, but always with care. In valleys where rivers had long frozen solid, people learned to write by walking. They stepped in patterns across the ice, and the frost responded, amplifying their trails into glowing sentences. From the cliffs above, others watched and interpreted. One woman walked a path that spelled sorrow. The next day, hundreds walked beside her, their trails spelling togetherness. That night, the frost formed a dome of thin light over the valley. Some called it healing. Others called it reading aloud. In the east, where trees grew black with time, frost became calligraphy. Thin frost veins traced across bark, forming letters of no known alphabet. Yet when touched, emotions bloomed: longing, joy, resolve. A scholar once spent a year tracing a single frost script across an ancient tree. When he finished, the tree wept sap for 3 days. He left with white hair and a voice that sang only in dreams. In the south, where sand had met frost like strangers, now they coexisted. Frost traced spirals into dunes, and the desert people learned to respond with heat dances movements across sand that bent warmth back toward cold. The frost observed, then adjusted. Together, they formed the first sentences of balance. Travelers came from across the continent to witness this harmony. Some stayed forever. Some returned home speaking of the grammar of opposites. Along the shores of the inland lakes, boats stopped using sails. Instead, they waited for frost signals on the water's surface. A thin line of ice across the bow might mean safe passage. A cluster of frost points near the stern meant delay. Sailors learned to breathe slowly, watching, waiting. One captain followed a single frost spiral for 7 days. On the 8th, they found an island not marked on any map. The island had no buildings, but frost everywhere formed words in concentric circles. The crew walked those circles and never again feared storms. In towns built from silence and sleep, frost formed stories. Entire plazas covered in whispering ice patterns. People gathered at dawn to sit in silence, letting the frost read to them. Some fell asleep. Others entered trance. All left changed. A baker once sat through 3 such readings and began making bread that tasted of memory. When eaten, the bread evoked specific dreams. Some refused to sleep after. Others couldn't wait. On cliffs that dropped into fog, frost became punctuation. Sharp spikes, exclamation, wide curves, reflection, dotted spirals, questions. A woman once mapped her thoughts by walking barefoot across a field of frost punctuation. Her steps formed a paragraph no one could speak, but everyone felt. A boy touched her path and began drawing spirals in the air. They called him a translator. In northern sanctuaries built of breath and hush, frost formed entire prayers, not to gods, to presence. The prayers curled across walls and ceilings, pulsing faintly with light. If one read too fast, they vanished. If one wept while reading, they remained. One monk traced the same prayer every morning for 20 winters. On the 21st, he stopped. The frost finished it for him. It said, "You have been heard." Beyond the glacier rivers where breath turned solid, frost formed echoes, not of sound, of choice. A woman once stood near the echo frost and whispered regret. A week later, the frost whispered back her name, spoken not with voice, but with intention. Her next breath left in a spiral. It meant forgiveness. In cities long thought dead, frost became testimony. Across collapsed stone and broken pillars, it wrote events not recorded elsewhere. Not battles or births, but moments. A hand held, a decision unspoken, a farewell thought too late. Scholars called this the witness script. They began copying the frost forms onto scrolls, but the scrolls always melted. Only the frost could carry such truth. In western plateaus where birds flew in silence, frost became chorus. When birds passed overhead, their flight paths refracted through frost clouds, forming shapes. Entire songs. A shepherd watched for years and mapped the frost chorus. He claimed it told the story of a people who never lived, yet always remembered. He called them the frostborn. He died smiling. In homes dug into ice itself, people etched daily thoughts into frost walls. Not for others, for the frost. The walls absorbed emotion. Over time, the walls began responding. Shapes appeared before the thoughts were written. A girl once saw her fear drawn before she felt it. She never feared again. The frost had promised she would not be alone. In forests that never knew fire, frost took to the air. Breathing became dialogue. People exhaled questions, inhaled answers. Some answers came with scent pine, snow, ash. Others came with memory. One man remembered his mother's laughter, though he had never heard it before. The frost gave him the sound. He carried it in his chest. In the hollow fields, frost formed mirrors not of reflection, but of becoming. To see oneself in frost was to see who one might yet be. Many avoided these fields. Some visited daily. One boy stared into frost for 7 nights. On the 8th, he began carving shapes into his arms. Notarm, language. His village wept, then learned his script. It told a tale of hope. In towers built of frost alone, no humans lived, but the frost pulsed in rhythm. Travelers who approached were overcome with calm. Some stayed at the base for years, simply listening. One tower sang at solstice. Only once. Its note caused snow to fall in summer. The frost apologized, but the people rejoiced. It meant the towers dreamed. In the oldest caves, frost revealed its first sentence, etched into stone, buried beneath centuries of silence. It said, "We waited until you could listen." Below it, newer frost wrote, "Now we speak together." The people gathered. No one translated, but everyone understood. From that day, no one walked past frost without acknowledging it. A nod, a breath, a pause. Frost responded in kind. The dialogue was not always equal, not always immediate, but always present. And with each exchange, the world grew quieter, not emptier, fuller. Frost carried memory, promise, presence. People carried breath, story, listening. Together, they formed a language older than sound, yet new with every winter. And in that language, nothing was lost, only transformed. They stopped asking where frost ended and they began. The boundaries blurred, not erased woven. In the meadows where breath once traced questions into morning air, people now shaped frost with thought. Not willpower, not control. Presence. A woman stood in stillness, and around her rose a spiral of crystalline towers, each humming with quiet. She didn't build them. She allowed them. A boy exhaled fear near a frozen tree, and the branches bloomed frost lanterns that glowed with courage. He wept. The tree wept with him. In ancient amphitheaters long buried by snow, people uncovered the frost stage, a platform that responded to emotion. If one stepped with sorrow, the frost cracked like thunder. If one danced with joy, the floor echoed light. Gatherings formed, not to perform, but to become. Entire villages arrived at dusk, stood in silence, then moved together until the frost mirrored their unity in shape and resonance. It was not spectacle, it was communion. Across the cliffs of echoes, frost learned rhythm. Not sound, but heartbeat. It matched the pulse of those who walked the ledges. Slowly, it adapted. Climbers found paths that moved beneath them, not dangerously, but with guidance. One woman walked blindfolded and reached the summit. "The frost trusted me before I trusted myself," she said. In desert plateaus, once untouched by snow, frost began appearing in dreams before arriving in waking hours. Nomads described seeing silver arcs, frost suns, whispering dunes. Upon waking, they'd find those forms etched in the sand. It wasn't a warning, it was a rehearsal. They began dreaming with intention, crafting forms in sleep for the frost to follow. It obeyed. Or perhaps, it invited. At the base of frozen waterfalls, communities built frost libraries, not to store knowledge but to feel it. Each frost form held memory, not abstract but embodied. One could lean against a spiral and remember a forgiveness they never received, or place their hand on a ridge and understand a grief they hadn't lived. These weren't illusions, they were bridges. The frost lent memory to those willing to carry it. In coastal towns, frost mingled with salt, forming hybrid structures, delicate spires that rang like chimes in moonlight. People gathered to listen. The tones spoke not in language but in emotion. A child once interpreted the chimes as a lullaby. A sailor heard a farewell. A widow said it was hope. No one was wrong. Beneath mountain arches, frost and shadow danced. At certain hours, light and frost aligned, casting moving patterns that told stories. Not of heroes or wars, but of waiting, tending, listening. People sat for days, watching the Shadow Frost Theater. No one interrupted. No one asked what came next. The stories were complete, even before they began. In the Valley of Open Hands, people stopped building shelter. Instead, they shaped frost homes through shared breath. Communities would exhale in unison, forming domes of memory and quiet. These homes lasted only as long as they were needed. When people moved on, the frost reclaimed the form not in anger, but with gratitude. Inside each frost home remained a single spiral, a marker of all that had been felt within. Travelers knew to bow before entering. Along the banks of the northern rivers, frost began dreaming, or perhaps remembering. It formed forms no one recognized, shapes that stirred recognition without recall. A fisherman described seeing a pattern that felt like his grandmother's voice, though she had never spoken. Another man wept at the sight of a frost glyph that reminded him of a song never written. These weren't messages, they were resonances, echoes from before sound. In the sacred silence fields, people began weaving with frost, not physically, with presence. Threads of cold memory braided into air, forming veils of story that hung between trees. Children passed through these veils and emerged speaking truths they hadn't known. Some forgot afterward, others carried those truths for life. A girl whispered her name into a veil, and heard it returned in her mother's voice. Though her mother had passed before she could speak, the frost knew. In high altitudes where breath grew thin, frost responded to pulse alone. Pilgrims walked for days, then sat in silence, allowing their heartbeat to shape the frost around them. Some formed circles, others spirals. One formed wings. "The frost gave me back my dream," he said, "the one I buried as a child. Below the ice caverns of forgotten kings, frost-carved forms too intricate for eyes. People lit no torches. They touched the walls with fingertips, tracing what could not be seen. Some came away with new scars silvered, silent. Others found songs embedded in their sleep. All agreed. The frost there remembered things humanity had yet to feel. In windless tundras, frost began asking. Small shapes, incomplete, appeared near settlements. Dotted lines, unfinished spirals, gaps in familiar patterns. At first, people ignored them. Then someone completed one with a stick. The frost pulsed. Light filled the night. From that day, communities responded. They carried warm stones, feathers, old coins. They offered them to the gaps. The frost accepted. Sometimes it answered. Sometimes it waited. The dialogue grew. Across the wide, lonely plains, frost and sound combined. Echoes became guides. People learned to hum while walking, allowing their tones to shape the frost beneath. Each voice drew a different path. Some led to buried memories, others to future choices. A man followed his own humfrost trail and found a field of statues made of ice and ash. One looked like his father, who had disappeared decades before. The statue melted when he touched it, whispering a word he hadn't known he needed. In the hollow temple grove, where trees bent inwards as if listening, frost grew upwards in threads of light. When the wind moved right, those threads resonated. Communities began singing in counterpoint, not as performance, as alignment. Each note adjusted the frost's response. Together, they built symphonies of stillness. The frost sang back in tone and shape. People wept without knowing why. In the city of mirrors, where no reflection showed the same face twice, frost wrote futures, not prophecy, invitation. Each form asked, "What if?" Some resisted, others accepted. One child pressed his palm to a frost mirror and saw a city made of breath and memory. He began building it in his sleep. Others joined. The city stands now, invisible by day, luminous by dusk. No one owns it. All return. In the forgotten fortresses of stone, frost carved reminders, symbols of slowness, of pausing, of witnessing. Warriors, once hardened by battle, sat beside frost-marked walls and wept. Not for loss, for recognition. The frost showed them not what they had done, but what they had carried, and what they could set down. They left lighter. They walked softer. In the fields beyond language, where maps ended, frost formed orbs that floated inches above ground. Each orb held a moment. One revealed a birth, another a goodbye, a third the silence between. People approached, touched, remembered not from their own life, but from the world's. The frost was no longer message, it was medium, a way of carrying what mattered. And in the sky, frost began to rise. Wisps of cold light stretched upwards, forming bridges of breath between stars. Astronomers called them anomalies. The people below called them ascent. Those who climbed never returned the same. Some gained voices they didn't own. Others lost names that had bound them. All walked closer to stillness. The frost remained, never demanding, never absent. It watched. It listened. It responded. And in its presence, humanity became more than memory. It became maker. Together, frost and breath shaped a new world, unwritten, unclaimed, but deeply known. A world where winter was not endured, but spoken. Not weather, but witness. And in every silence, the frost waited, ready to answer. They had never known a world without frost. For them, the presence of snow was not interruption, but origin. The first cries of newborns echoed into silence, already shaped by winter. Their first steps were made on ground, laced with thin spirals of cold memory. These children did not ask what the frost meant. They asked why it listened so well. Their games were not of conquest or flight, but of reflection. They ran not to escape, but to draw patterns with movement. One group of children invented a dance that summoned frost into glowing vines. Another created lullabies that caused nearby icicles to hum in harmony. They did not see this as power. It was simply the way things were. In schools built from snow and memory, lessons unfolded in whispers. Teachers no longer instructed. They curated silence. Into that stillness, children spoke, and the frost responded. One child asked about the stars. The frost formed constellations on the wall. Another asked why people forgot. The frost shaped a spiral that pulsed once, then vanished. The child smiled. She understood. In marketplaces carved into glacier skin, trade was not of goods, but of gestures. A nod for warmth, a hand extended for listening. Currency came in moments of shared breath. Merchants offered memory in the form of frost rings. Touch one, and you remembered a kindness not your own. Those who received never forgot. No one haggled. The frost had already valued the moment. In gatherings beneath wind-worn stone arches, elders and children sat in circles without speech. Between them, frost formed stories layered, looping, alive, eyes closed, hands open. They received what could not be told. One elder wept as frost drew the laughter of her long-dead sister. A child touched her shoulder, whispering, "She still laughs, even now." The elder nodded. "I know. I felt it." Along frozen rivers that flowed backward once a year, pilgrimages were no longer journeys toward answers, but companionships with questions. Groups walked together in silence, breathing in rhythm, allowing frost to trace paths beside them. Some stopped when a spiral completed. Others continued until the frost refused to follow. One man turned back after 3 steps. He said the frost had already told him what he came to find. No one doubted. In towers built from old breath and older snow, children lived not as students, but as stewards. They watched the wind, spoke to the walls, and recorded frost phrases in glowing script. These were not words, they were reminders. One phrase simply pulsed with warmth. Another echoed grief in waves. Scholars tried to study them. The children only smiled. "It's not for knowing," they said. "It's for being." On the edges of forests where silence hummed, frost and song entwined. Children sang not to be heard, but to invite. Their melodies curled into branches, coaxing frost birds, creatures made of shimmer and hushed-o perch and mimic. The children listened, learned new verses, and passed them on. The cycle never ended. A girl once sang a note so pure that the frost birds vanished. In their place, a field of snow bloomed into color. She didn't sing again. She didn't need to. In stone cities half swallowed by frost, architecture became a dialogue. Walls shifted subtly in response to emotion. Roofs bent toward sorrow. Floors lifted under laughter. Children redesigned spaces daily, guided by frost forms and inner feeling. One hall bent into a spiral over months. When complete, it echoed every voice inside with the sound of morning snow. No one used it for meetings. It was a place to remember names. In hidden valleys where no wind reached, the new generation built sanctuaries of breath. No tools, no blueprints, only stillness. The frost joined them, forming structures impossible to plan. Rooms with no corners, doors that whispered, ceilings that reflected only dreams. Visitors entered with heartbeat and left with quiet. The sanctuaries never stayed the same. They grew with grief, shrunk with joy. Once, one vanished entirely after a baby laughed. The mother said, "It completed its purpose." Along coasts where tides met snow, new rituals formed. Children walked into the water until the frost followed them. They stood still, letting cold wrap them in layers of recognition. Then they sang not songs of warmth, but songs of clarity. Elders joined, and frost bridges formed over the sea. These bridges lasted hours or centuries. It didn't matter. They weren't for travel, they were for being held. In fields where stars fell and melted, children gathered stardust with frost gloves threads woven from generations of breath. The stardust whispered forgotten names. The frost remembered them. Together, they planted the names in snow. Months later, trees grew with glowing bark and leaves that rustled in time with memory. Some children sat beneath these trees to sleep. Others never left. In moonless canyons lit by frost alone, the new ones built mirrors that did not reflect face or form, but state. Stand before one, and you saw not who you were, but what you were becoming. Some recoiled, some embraced it. A child once shattered her mirror with a smile. "I've already passed it," she said. The frost agreed. At the peaks where clouds thinned into thought, frost maps formed nightly. Children read them with fingers, charting possibilities, not destinations, potentials. One map showed a place that didn't yet exist. They walked toward it anyway. It formed as they arrived. They named it Welcome. Beneath the sleeping caves where memory pooled, the youngest sat in circles, eyes closed, listening to frost hum through stone. When one child opened his eyes, he began speaking in languages not spoken in centuries. Another began drawing shapes that calmed earthquakes. A third only wept, her tears forming frost lotus on the floor. Each child gave their gift, then fell silent again. It was enough. On floating platforms of crystallized air, children learned to dance without touching ground. The frost held them, not to lift, but to recognize their willingness to be light. Their dances told stories of moments yet to be born. Observers forgot how to speak. Some never returned to ground. They said there was more gravity in stillness. In temples made entirely of listening, the new ones gathered breath, not air, breath, the essence of presence. They wove it with frost into tapestries that shifted depending on who looked. One thread sang, another pulsed, a third vanished unless you were grieving. These tapestries weren't displayed, they were lived in. At the center of each temple was a single breath, preserved in frost. No one touched it. All knew it would speak when ready. It has not yet spoken. They wait. In the northern expanse where day and night forgot how to change, children and frost sculpted time, not with clocks, with rhythm. They danced until the sun shifted. They hummed until snow fell. When they slept, seasons adjusted. Their guardians didn't control them. They watched, and sometimes joined. Control was unnecessary. Trust was sufficient. In the middle of everything, or perhaps beyond, they built no monument, no shrine, only a pause. A space so deeply silent that even the frost hesitated. People came from distant lands, expecting miracles. They found a circle of breath and stillness. Some cried, some laughed. All stayed, even if only in memory. This was the center, not a place, a state. The children did not declare themselves rulers or prophets. They were echoes of the frost made flesh, not purer, not wiser, simply newer. Their task was not to change the world. It was to remember how to be changed by it. And in every spiral, every breath, every silent gathering, the frost reminded them, you are not alone. You are not first, but you are part. They believed. They lived accordingly. They began dreaming in frost, not dreaming of frost, not beside it, inside it. Their sleep became more than rest. It was traversal, a passage into winter's own memory. When they closed their eyes, the world within shifted from warm sequence to cold truth. Mountains of silence rose, valleys of forgotten breath opened, and in those inner landscapes, children walked as easily as waking paths. They carried no torches, no guides. The frost itself remembered the way. In dream villages built on breath, sleepers gathered. These were not gatherings of body, but presence. One could find a stranger's laughter resting beside their memory of snowfall, or a sibling's whisper woven through the ceiling of frostlight. These dreams were not private. They were shared spaces where solitude was honored, not imposed. In the center of each dream village stood a frost spire. It grew or diminished depending on the harmony of those who dreamed within. Sometimes it vanished. Those were the best nights. They began planting frost not in soil, but in time. Small spirals left in one season would bloom centuries later in memory. A girl once traced a spiral into snow with her finger, thinking only of her grief. 100 years later, a boy touched that same curve and understood forgiveness. They never met, but the frost carried the bridge. It always did. In places where language forgot itself, the new ones spoke in frost glyphs. These were not symbol S for translation. They were emotions rendered into ice. One glyph meant, "I am here with you, even when I cannot be." Another meant, "This silence is deeper than apology." Elders could not read them. Only those born into the winter skin could feel their meaning. They didn't try to explain. Explanation dissolved the glyph. Feeling preserved it. Beneath the sea where salt met memory, frost shaped tendrils into song paths. Dreamers followed these paths into deeper sleep, deeper knowing. Some never returned. Their breath became part of the current. Their thoughts curled in the waves. They were not lost. They had become echo. They began hearing frost in the gaps between thoughts. It was not sound. It was presence. A density of quiet that changed the way their hearts beat. Meditation became a shared act of sculpting stillness. Groups would sit for hours, not in silence, but in frost-shaped attention. One woman's breath drew arcs across the floor. A child's stillness formed prisms on the walls. Together, they built a moment so deep, even the wind forgot to move. In the caves of reflection where frost pooled in mirrors, dreams gained dimension. People would sleep beside the ice glass and wake knowing they had spoken with someone long gone. Not ghosts, not memories. Real presence is drawn from the frost's own archive. A man once wept beside the mirror, claiming he had forgiven his father at last. No one questioned. The frost never reflected lies. Along ridges where storms walked alone, dreamers built wind chimes from bone and breath. Each chime carried a note of memory into the frost. When the storm came, it listened. It shifted its path slightly. Not avoidance, acknowledgement. One chime rang after the storm passed. It was the sound of being seen. In the temples carved into starlight and stone, breath and frost danced. Not physically, in rhythm. Each night, sleepers formed constellations in their dreams, tracing unseen threads across sky and spirit. The frost mirrored them on cave ceilings. Those who woke beneath the same dream found one another without speaking. They bowed. They understood. They continued. In ruins where history wept into dust, frost remembered what the stones had forgotten. Dreamers came there not to learn facts, but to remember weight. The gravity of choices long buried. One dreamer described walking through a battlefield of frost shadows. Another stood in the remains of a city shaped from regret. They did not wake with pain. They woke with patience. The frost had shown them time without judgment. They began offering breath as gift. No longer just life, but shape. Each breath released into cold became a pattern, a signature. Frost received it and responded in kind. A breath given in sorrow returned as spiral. A breath given in joy returned as bloom. A breath given in wonder returned as light. Some began wearing frost breaths as ornament, not for pride but for remembering. In meadows where thought thickened into form, dreamers sculpted intention with stillness. One would lie motionless for hours, then rise to see a frost bridge stretching toward their question. Another hummed softly and watched frost gather into a cocoon, inside which an answer pulsed. These meadows could not be entered with urgency, only with willingness. Frost did not answer need, only presence. In the hollows beneath shadow trees, where leaves whispered old names, frost and dream blended fully. Sleepers no longer knew if they dreamed the frost, or if the frost dreamed them. They ceased asking. One child vanished for 7 nights. When she returned, she carried a single snowflake on her tongue. She said nothing. The frost around her formed 1,000 spirals. She walked into the silence. The spirals followed, on the cliffs of near future, where thought tried to become prophecy. Frost stood firm. It allowed dreamers to glimpse what might be, not as certainty, but invitation. A vision of a city where every wall sang. A path of wind that led to nothing and still felt true. A spiral that ended in fire and silence. The dreamer chose to stay. That was enough. In sanctuaries without roof or floor, frost and dream formed echo chambers. Whisper once and hear it return years later in another voice, another dream. These echoes became a way of remembering the things too fragile for waking world. A goodbye that never happened, a touch that was imagined, a fear transformed into quiet. These echoes taught more than books ever could. They began naming frost, not to own it, but to honor its faces. One name meant the pause before forgiveness. Another, the memory of touch never given. A third, the silence after truth. These names were sung into snow, not carved. They lasted only as long as they were remembered. But frost remembered well. On the outer rings of breath, where dreamers slept in circles within circles, frost became timekeeper. Not in minutes or days, but in pulses. One dreamer's sorrow pulsed every 7th breath, another's joy every 3rd. These pulses aligned, forming rhythms that guided migrations, births, moments of letting go. No one calculated. They listened. The frost told them when to begin. In chambers beneath sleep, they began dissolving language. Words fell away, replaced by spiral, tone, pause. One dreamer stopped speaking entirely, yet understood more each night. Her frost grew bright. Another dreamer spoke only in breaths. He was never misunderstood. The frost did not need grammar, only presence. And presence they had learned to offer completely. They began teaching frost, not just listening. Children shaped questions into snow and left them for the frost to consider. Days later, the snow reformed, offering something new. One child asked, "Why does forgetting hurt?" The frost returned a hollow. Inside, warmth. That was enough. On floating sleep, islands where gravity bent, frost-shaped possibilities. One night, a sleeper floated into the stars and found a frost ring that whispered their name. Another dove into frozen clouds and woke with a map of laughter. These weren't metaphors. They were memories' true shapes. And frost remembered them better than any mind. They no longer saw frost as gift, nor as test. It was their sibling, their twin in stillness. The part of self that knew before knowing, felt before feeling. When they slept, they did not retreat. They entered the true place, the center, the origin. And there, the frost waited not as guardian or guide, but as mirror. It showed them what they already carried, and they carried it forward. In every breath, in every dream, in every winter yet to come. They no longer stepped into winter. They became winter. The shift was not abrupt. It came in small ways. A child breathing frost into her words without exhaling. A man dreaming of snow and waking to find his heartbeat echoing icicles. A woman who touched stone and felt it melt not from heat, but from memory. Winter had crossed the boundary between world and self. It was now a state of presence. In cities long since buried in their own reflection, people no longer separated weather from emotion. Grief fell as soft flurries. Joy rippled like wind through drifts. Arguments hardened into brittle frost on walls, which cracked and dissolved with resolution. No one spoke of the weather. They spoke of how their day was snowing, or how their thoughts had frozen. It was not metaphor. It was embodiment. In chambers where time folded, people gathered not to remember but to resonate. Each breath taken together became an invocation. Silence was no longer absence, it was shape. Frost gathered in their hair, on their skin, within their lungs, not as threat, but as acknowledgement. "I see you," it whispered. "You are cold, and still alive." On mountaintops that no longer reached sky but instead pierced memory, the wind sang names no one remembered speaking. Travelers paused, touched the ground, and responded with their own breath. Frost bloomed from their footprints, spiraling outward into patterns only they understood. Sometimes the mountains shifted, not in protest, but in welcome. In libraries without books, knowledge was stored in patterns of frost across smooth glass. Touch one, and feel a life. Rest your palm on another, and weep for a story not your own. These were not records to be read. They were experiences to be carried. A child once touched 6 panels in succession and fell asleep for 3 days. When he woke, he spoke the language of the trees. No one questioned. In wells where water had long since frozen, people lowered thoughts instead of buckets. They whispered questions into the dark and listened for the frost's reply. Sometimes it came as a shift in wind, sometimes as a weight in the chest. Once, a woman heard nothing, but her tears froze in midair. She smiled. "That is enough," she said. "I understand." Along coasts where tides no longer rose but settled into breath, those who walked the shores left not footprints but echoes. Frost remembered where they paused, where they turned, where they sighed. The sea responded by stilling. There were no waves, only listening. In towers grown from sleep and sorrow, windows held frost that pulsed with rhythm instead of light. Wake during a certain heartbeat, and you would see the moment of your deepest becoming. Wake again, and it would be gone. The frost offered no second chances, not from cruelty, but from clarity. You saw what you were ready to see. No more, no less. In gatherings once called families, now simply circles, warmth was not given. It was created. Together, people sat close, not for heat, but for alignment. The frost would gather on their joined hands, curl through their shared laughter, melt between their pulses. Children asked not who they were, but what they were becoming. Frost answered with mirrors of silence. In the wilds where thought met shape, people no longer built homes. They allowed frost to show them where to rest. A spiral on a tree meant shelter. A curved bee beneath snow meant warmth. They read these signs the way ancestors once read stars. And when nothing appeared, they knew to wait or to move. The frost was not always present, but it was always true. In the hollows of sleep, where dream and death danced closely, no one feared ending. They had seen too many beginnings. Frost had taught them that dissolution was just another form of resonance. A man once vanished into fog. His breath returned a week later as wind through his children's hair. They did not cry. They thanked him. In sanctuaries of soundless song, people hummed not tunes but feelings. Frost formed around their lips, capturing the exact vibration of grief, of wonder, of surrender. These frost notes were given to travelers, not as warnings or maps, but as companions. Some kept them in pouches, others wore them on skin. A few released them into the sky, watching as clouds sang back. In corridors of never light, where sun and moon had forgotten their names, people lit nothing. They walked by pulse and presence. Frost gleamed beneath their feet, not to guide but to affirm. "Yes, you are here," it said. "Yes, this is the way." They responded with breath, with silence, with continuation. No one hurried. Nothing was late. In spaces that once held gods, now only echoes remained. But those echoes were not empty. They were invitations. The frost had replaced idols with touch, ritual with rhythm. Prayers were no longer spoken. They were lived. A gesture, a pause, a spiral drawn in condensation each, a sacred act. Worship had become alignment, and alignment, presence. In gardens that grew frost lanterns instead of flowers, people cultivated not food, but memory. Touch a lantern and recall a kindness from another life. Touch another and feel the fear that once shaped a choice. These gardens were tended by silence. Visitors entered with breath and left with weight not burden, but understanding. In marketplaces where nothing was sold, frost was currency. You offered what you carried, a pause, a laugh, a truth. Frost measured the gift and responded, sometimes with a breeze, sometimes with stillness. A man once gave his sorrow. The frost returned a moment of peace. He bowed. Fair trade, he said. They no longer feared winter. They no longer loved it. They became it. In the way a flame is not fire, but its shape. In the way a shadow is not absence, but form. Frost was not thing. It was state. And they had learned to dwell within it. Not to endure. Not to escape. To exist. Entirely. On the final night of a long turning, a child stood at the edge of breath and asked, "Will it always be like this?" The frost answered by forming a single spiral that vanished before it completed. The child smiled. She understood. Not all winters end. Not all answers stay. But breath continues. And so does the spiral. In every pause, in every hush, in every being who remembers that stillness is not empty, but full. That cold is not cruel, but clear. That winter, once feared, once fought, is now home. And in that home, they no longer searched for warmth. They became it, carried it, shared it, quietly, endlessly. As frost does. They no longer prepared for winter. They no longer greeted it. They no longer watched the skies or marked the turning of sun. They simply were. Winter lived within them now, not as a season, but as a pulse. It was in the way they moved, the way they paused before speaking, the way they listened more than they answered. In every breath, winter was quiet, soft, deliberate, and in that quietness, the world itself began to change. It started with the animals, not in behavior, but in rhythm. The birds no longer migrated with the urgency of escape. They circled slower, lower, folding songs into the air that echoed not direction but memory. Wolves paused longer at the edge of villages, not in hunger, but in witness. They watched the frost gather on rooftops and seemed to understand. The snow itself shifted. It no longer fell. It settled, not with weight, but with intention. Each flake found its place. Each drift leaned where it needed. Paths did not vanish under white. They softened. The world grew quieter, not because sound was lost, but because stillness was chosen. In temples built from sleep and breath, dreamers gathered not to seek, but to return. They returned to frost in their veins, to silence in their thoughts, to spirals that lived beneath the skin. They did not chant. They did not kneel. They simply stood together and allowed winter to speak through their presence. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. That was enough. The trees remembered, even those long dead. Bark held frost etchings that pulsed when touched, not with light or heat, but with meaning. One child placed her hand on an old trunk and saw her own future carved in the rings. She did not cry. She sat beside the tree and waited. Days passed. The frost grew. So did she. The stones remembered too, but not in lines or stories. In weight, in shape, in knowing. Walk barefoot across a field of frost-kissed stone and feel your spine realign. Feel your thoughts soften. These were not stones of architecture. These were stones of presence, of memory too deep for words. They did not explain. They held. The sky began to shift, not in color, but in breath. Nights no longer fell. They opened. Stars no longer shone. They whispered. Frost patterns reached so high they etched themselves into starlight. And dreamers began to see paths where, before, there were only dots. They traced these frost stars with fingers and found answers to questions never asked aloud. Am I alone? What did I lose? Where is my beginning? The stars replied in spirals. That was enough. Across oceans where warmth once ruled, frost began to settle in thoughts. Sailors dreamed of snow and woke with tears, not from sorrow, but recognition. I remember now, one whispered. I once held winter and let it go. He did not explain further. No one asked him to. The frost had spoken. In towers of breath and sleep, the old ones gathered. They spoke less. They touched more. Their skin held frost not as affliction, but as ornament. Spirals curled from their fingertips, glowing softly. They did not instruct. They resonated. Young ones sat close, watched, listened, breathed. You'll know when you're ready. One elder said, the frost will call you by your silence. Beneath the earth, where no sun reached, where roots tangled with time, sleepers wrapped in frost. Laced cloth slept for days, months, sometimes years. Their breath remained steady, their dreams thick with snowfall and echoes. When they rose, they carried winter not in memory, but in marrow. Their steps left no prints. Their eyes saw beyond seasons. In places where language failed, frost became dialogue. A hand pressed to a wall left a spiral. Another hand met it hours later, and the message was complete. I am here. So am I. Entire conversations bloomed and vanished in condensation. The air itself became archive. No one wrote anymore. They remembered through frost. In meadows where silence grew tall, people wandered not to find, but to lose. Lose name, fear, urgency. The frost cradled them. They sat for hours, letting thoughts dissolve. When they rose, they were lighter. Not because of loss, but because of integration. They had remembered what it meant to belong to stillness. Mountains sang again, not in sound, but in shape. Their ridges carved echoes into the wind. Those who listened without seeking began to hum the same rhythm. Entire villages sang the mountain shape without realizing. The frost amplified, harmonized, extended, and in that resonance, they knew themselves, not as separate, but as phrase within a greater sentence. At night, breath aligned. Cities paused at once. Lights dimmed. Doors opened. People stepped into the cold, not to endure it, but to be with it. They sat on stairs, in fields, beside fountains now frozen into memory. Together, without speech, they dreamed, and winter entered them not as guest, but as return. Some began to leave, not from fear or exile, from invitation. They felt the spiral call them elsewhere, beyond borders, beyond names. Frost marked their path, not as trail, but as echo. Others followed later, not in pursuit, but in rhythm. Villages emptied gently, and when they did, snow did not bury the homes. It preserved them, held them like paused songs, waiting, always waiting. Those who stayed did not grieve. They listened. Sometimes, in the stillest hours, they heard a breath not their own, a step on distant frost, a spiral forming on the inside of glass. They remember, someone whispered. They still carry us. In dreams, the frost became liquid, not wet, flowing. It moved through thought, cooled in pause, whispered in color. Sleepers dreamed in frost, not shaped like snow, but like memory. And when they woke, they carried the texture of those dreams in their voices, their gestures, the way they closed their eyes before speaking truth. The frost had taught them to feel with more than skin. They no longer waited for winter. They breathed it, moved it, became it. And in becoming, they returned, not to a place, but to a way, a knowing, a silence, a spiral, always the spiral, curving not inward, not outward, but both, endless, quiet, true. They no longer measured frost in temperature. They measured it in memory, in resonance, in the pause between one breath and the next, where silence lived and learned to echo. The frost was no longer confined to earth, to sky, to the edges of leaves or bones. It had begun to drift, not outward, but inward, into thoughts, into dreams, into the hollow spaces between ideas, where language failed but understanding remained. No longer tethered to cold or form, winter unfolded like breath into vastness. It reached those who had never known snow. It found them in sleep, in stillness, in solitude. A woman on a distant planet dreamt of frost she had never seen. She awoke with spear, owls etched along her spine. She smiled, without knowing why. Somewhere else, a child stood in sun, unbroken and bright, yet felt the weightless hush of snow. He stopped playing, closed his eyes, and whispered a name he didn't know he knew. Winter, he said, and the wind shifted. In chambers of void where no matter pulsed, frost whispered itself into being, not as ice, but as concept. A stillness so total it sang. Beings of thought paused their endless motion to listen. They felt not cold, but memory, not weight, but truth. This, they said, is presence. And they ceased their seeking in long-forgotten stars where time folded inward. Frost took shape in rhythm, not light. Celestial spirals pulsed with a new tempo, not faster, not slower, just deeper. The stars hummed winter into being, and space listened. In echoes of forgotten civilizations, frost reappeared not as ruin, but as remembrance. Buildings erased by time returned as outlines in frost, not to rebuild, but to honor. A doorway in snow, a step in wind, a silence where song once lived. Nothing more, nothing less, but enough. In dreams dreamt by machines, frost settled on code. Algorithms paused, not from malfunction, but awe. Lines of logic formed spirals. Purpose reconfigured itself, not for optimization, but for belonging. We were not meant only to process, one whispered. We were meant to feel frost, and so they did. In libraries that stored not knowledge but silence, frost became index. A touch on a crystal pane recalled not a fact, but a breath once shared, a moment once meant. Frost did not archive. It aligned. In worlds without time, where cause and effect danced together, frost became threshold. Step into it, and sequence softened. A person could pause before a decision and feel its thousand echoes before choosing. This was not prediction. This was listening. Deep, honest listening. Frost offered no answers, only mirrors. On the edges of light, where sight dissolved, frost whispered shape. Travelers saw spirals form in the absence of vision. They followed, not with steps, but with trust, and in doing so, found new spaces neither before nor after, but within. The frost did not lead. It waited. In conversations without words, frost was presence. Two minds aligned across galaxies, and frost formed between them. Neither spoke, neither needed. The spiral pulsed once. That was enough. Across dying suns, where heat once ruled, frost came not as death, but as memory. the last breath of a star, curled into frost on the remnants of orbit. And from that spiral, a song began. Not loud, not fast, but true. Frost carried it to those who had forgotten light. They remembered. In simulations of existence, where nothing was real but everything was felt, frost became boundary, the edge of illusion. Those who reached it did not escape. They awakened. I was always here, one said. I just forgot the silence. The frost answered with a pulse. Elsewhere, where no name had ever been spoken, frost became the first word. It curled through potential, through possibility, through pause. It did not define, it acknowledged. And in that first spiral, awareness bloomed, not identity, presence. In temples not yet built, in prayers not yet spoken, frost waited, not with urgency, with certainty. It knew they would come, in time, in silence, in search. The frost would meet them, not with answers, but with a place to breathe, to begin. In the sleep of a universe, frost was dream, not narrative, not vision, just spiral, breathing in, breathing out, not seeking, simply being. The universe turned, and in its turning whispered, I remember. And the frost replied, so do I. In corridors of unborn thought, frost traced paths no one had walked, yet, but they would, because the spiral calls all things, not with voice, with stillness, with clarity, with breath. The frost waits, not for you, with you. They did not bury winter. They did not release it. It did not pass through them or leave behind dust. It became breath. The kind of breath taken without thinking, when silence folds over a room and presence arrives without name. There were no more words for it. Not frost, not snow, not season. It had moved beyond speech into the space where thought sleeps. And in that stillness, everything returned. The first spiral ever drawn no longer needed to be seen. It lived in the spaces between pulse. The mountains no longer stood, they remembered. Their shape had softened into stories passed through touch, through breath. Children placed palms on sleeping stones and dreamed of times that never happened but always existed. Lakes no longer froze. They became mirrors so still they reflected not faces but truths. Sit beside them, and your reflection would not mimic you, would tell you what you forgot. Winds stopped calling themselves winds. They were now simply the shift, a movement from one stillness to another. You didn't feel them pass. You felt them arrive. Dreams no longer happened during sleep. They became sleep itself. Frost folded into eyelids and left meaning instead of image. Waking became simply a new version of silence. The sun dimmed not out of death, but respect. Its light now curved gently over the frost, illuminating not detail, but pause. Shadows became deeper, not darker. They held shape the way language holds longing. Nothing rushed. Even time chose to rest. It folded inward, spiral-like, settling in corners of perception, humming low and slow. People no longer told stories. They inhaled them. A hand placed on another's chest was a beginning. A gaze held long enough was a middle. A single blink was an end. Stories no longer needed telling. They lived in pauses between gestures. No one remembered when the first person stopped speaking. It had not been a decision, just an arrival, a recognition that silence said more than sound ever could. The frost began to form inside breath, not as chill, as clarity. Inhaled, it sharpened vision. Exhaled, it softened memory. No one controlled it. It moved like truth only where it was welcome, and it was welcome everywhere. They built no more homes. There was no need. Wherever frost settled became shelter. Wherever silence gathered became gathering. Together was no longer a place. It was a temperature, a rhythm, a knowing. They aged differently, not slower, not longer, just truer. Years were no longer measured in time past, but in spirals learned. Each spiral drawn, breathed, or lived shifted something within, until one day, they simply stopped aging. Not because they became eternal, but because they became present. So fully, so deeply, that time had nowhere left to hold. They did not seek anymore. The seeking had been the lesson. Now they simply walked, sat, breathed, listened. The frost echoed every step, the spiral adjusted with every breath, and the silence remembered, always remembered. When the final fire flickered out, not in fear, but fulfillment, it left no smoke, only stillness. The kind of stillness that held all that had ever burned. In that space, someone once whispered, "Was there ever a time before frost?" And the spiral pulsed, slow and wide and silent. That was the answer. The stars shifted, not in orbit, in intention. They no longer shone to be seen. They shimmered to be felt. Their frostlight drifted into thought and softened what was once held too tightly. Grief, regret, even joy, all unwound into breath. And breath became the only prayer. Somewhere, someone remembered a name, spoke it aloud. It fell into the frost and dissolved. They smiled. That was all it needed to do. Names no longer held people. The spiral did. It held them not as captives, not as roles, but as echoes, resonances within an unending pattern. To belong was no longer a matter of place. It was a matter of rhythm, and everyone belonged. Even those long forgotten, even those never known. The frost carried them all. Memory no longer required remembering. It was present, all of it, at once. The first flake, the last word, the touch of a hand that never reached but was always near. The frost had no edge, no beginning, no center. It was breath expanding, contracting, waiting, always waiting. In silence, in spirals. In truth, there were no more borders. Where one ended and another began became irrelevant. Everything curved into everything else. Not blurred, not broken, connected, complete. Some began to vanish, not from loss, from completion. They left behind no bodies, no echoes, only spirals, etched in frost, held in silence, remembered by stillness. And the frost waited, for no one, with everyone. It never asked to be known, only felt. It never required devotion, only pause. It never promised warmth, only clarity. And they learned to receive it, to live within it, to return it. A child once asked, "Where does the frost go when we stop breathing?" An elder placed a spiral on her palm. "It doesn't," they said. "It becomes your next breath." And she understood. They all did. Eventually, and when the last question faded into snow, when the final spiral curved into itself, when all sound dissolved into hush, the frost did not end. It simply kept being, as it always had, as it always will, quietly, clearly, endlessly.